I had been planning the trip for months. A solo camping weekend in the middle of nowhere, away from everything. No people, no roads, no cell service. Just trees, water, and silence. I picked a remote lake deep inside the national forest. You couldn't drive there, you had to hike in about 8 miles with all your gear on your back. That's what I wanted. Solitude, nature, just me and the woods. I packed light, just the basics: tent, sleeping bag, a jet boil for cooking, dried food, water filter, bear spray, small hatchet, and my GPS tracker. I left my phone in the glove box of my car at the trailhead. It was late spring, and the weather was perfect. Cool mornings, warm days, clear skies. I started out early on a Friday morning, and by late afternoon, I had reached the lake. It was beautiful. The water was still and clear, with tall trees all around it. There wasn't a single sign of people. No wrappers, no footprints, no old campfires. Just untouched land. I set up my tent on the northern edge of the lake, tucked under a few tall pines. I had a good view of the water and plenty of flat ground. There was a game trail not far off, deer or elk, maybe. I could hear birds, wind through the trees, the occasional splash from fish jumping. I felt relaxed, alive. This was exactly what I needed. The first night went smoothly. I cooked some ramen, made tea, sat on a rock by the water and watched the sun go down. It got cold fast after dark, but I had warm layers and a good sleeping bag. I zipped up tight and fell asleep easily, listening to the wind through the trees. The air was so fresh. I felt more rested in that one night than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rustling leaves. I stayed still, listening. Probably a squirrel or a bird, maybe even a deer. It passed quickly, and I got up and made oatmeal and coffee. I decided to follow the edge of the lake, maybe do a little fishing or exploring. I hiked around the water, taking my time, enjoying the silence. At one point, I found fresh tracks, not human, but large. Looked like moose. I followed them a bit out of curiosity, but they veered off into thick brush. I didn't want to get lost or tangled in undergrowth, so I headed back to my camp. That afternoon, I just relaxed. Read a book, filtered some more water, whittled a stick. Nothing unusual. I saw a couple of birds I didn't recognize and some chipmunks. No large animals. I cooked another simple meal and watched the stars come out. It was clearer than the night before, and I saw satellites, even a shooting star. I felt totally alone in a good way. No sounds but the occasional cracking twig or splash from the lake. I slept hard that night, too. It wasn't until the third day that things started to feel different. I woke up later than usual. The sun was already up. My tent was warm from the morning light, and I stretched inside my bag before unzipping the flap. As I stepped outside, I noticed something strange near my cooking area. A rock I had used to hold down a plastic bag was moved. The bag was shredded. I stared at it for a second. There were holes in it, like something had chewed through it, but it didn't look like small rodent bites. It looked torn, slashed, almost. I checked my food bag. It was untouched. I always hung it in a tree a good 20 feet away. Whatever had messed with the trash didn't find the food. Still, something had been here while I slept. I scanned the ground, looking for tracks. I found a few indentations in the dirt, but nothing clear. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or maybe a fox, but something about it didn't sit right. The bag was shredded too cleanly. I cleaned up the mess, packed everything away, and went about the day as usual. But I kept looking over my shoulder. I felt watched. I didn't hear anything unusual, just normal forest sounds, but the feeling stayed with me. That evening, I didn't feel like cooking. I just ate some trail mix and jerky. I built a small fire and kept it going for a while, staring into the flames. The night was quieter than before. No splashes in the lake, no wind, just stillness. When I turned in for the night, I zipped the tent up all the way and double-checked that my bear spray was next to my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up to little sounds. Creaks, snaps, small thumps. Normal forest stuff, but louder somehow. Closer. Around 3 a.m., I heard something that made me freeze. A crunch. Not a branch falling. Not a squirrel. A slow, steady crunch. Footsteps. Not fast, not heavy, but deliberate. I held my breath and listened. The steps came closer, then stopped. I couldn't tell how far away. Maybe 20 feet? 30? I waited. Nothing. No breathing, no more movement. Just dead quiet. I don't know how long I laid there, heart pounding, eyes wide open. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again, because the next thing I remember is light coming through the tent. I got up fast, unzipped the flap, and scanned the area. No one, no animals. Everything looked the same except the small fire pit. The ashes were disturbed, like someone had kicked at them. I hadn't done that. I left it neat, like I always do. Now the ashes were spread out, and a couple of charred sticks were lying outside the ring of rocks. I felt that knot in my stomach again. I checked the perimeter of my camp. Still no tracks I could make sense of. I walked a bit further out, maybe 50 feet. That's when I found it. A tree, a tall pine, maybe 30 years old, with fresh marks on the bark. Not scratches, not animal claw marks. Cuts. Long, deliberate cuts with clean edges, like someone had taken a knife and slowly carved into it. 3 long slashes, one under the other. I reached out and touched them. They were fresh. Sap still oozed slightly. That was it. I decided to leave. I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed everything up as quickly as I could. Barely ate. I kept checking over my shoulder every minute. I felt exposed the whole time. The trail back to the car was long, and I had to move fast. The sun was high when I started, but clouds rolled in quickly. Wind picked up. The woods felt darker, tighter. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I didn't stop for water or rest. I just kept moving, trying not to panic. A few hours into the hike, I noticed more cuts on trees along the trail. Not many, but enough to make me worry. They weren't there on the way in. They weren't from animals. They were human-made. Same pattern, long, clean slashes in the bark. Some were higher up, some lower, but always 3 lines, vertical. I kept going. No stopping. I didn't even pee. My shoulders ached from the pack, and my legs were cramping, but I didn't slow down. I felt hunted, not by an animal, but by something worse, a person. That thought dug into me. Someone had been watching. Someone had been near my tent. Someone had followed me. The last mile to the trailhead was the hardest. The path narrowed and twisted, and the trees were thick. I kept turning, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was never anyone there, just silence. I finally saw the clearing through the trees and almost cried with relief. My car was where I left it. Everything was intact. I threw my pack in the back seat and locked the doors before even taking my boots off. Then I sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to breathe. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station, about an hour away. I told them what happened. The shredded bag, the fire pit, the knife marks on the trees. They listened, wrote it down, and said they'd send someone out to check. But I could tell they thought I was just nervous, maybe spooked by a coyote or a bear. One of them said, "It's not uncommon to get a little paranoid out there when you're alone." But I knew what I saw. Those marks weren't from teeth or claws. They were made by a human hand. Someone with a blade. Someone who had been close enough to my tent to hear me breathing. Someone who had stood in the dark and watched. I don't know what they wanted or why they never made a move. Maybe they were just messing with me. Maybe they were building up to something worse. I don't know, and I don't want to know. I haven't been camping since. Not alone, not even with friends. I tried once, a few months later, but I couldn't do it. The moment the sun started going down, my chest tightened, and I had to leave. I still go on hikes, still spend time in the woods, but I stay near other people. I stay where there's signal. I keep my car close. I still think about those marks on the tree. Clean, deliberate. 3 lines like a symbol or a warning. I think about the fire pit, disturbed. The bag, shredded with purpose. The footsteps at night. The way the forest felt different on that 3rd day, like it was watching me. I'll never know who it was or what they wanted. But I got out. I made it home, and whatever they were planning, they didn't get the chance. That's enough for me. had been meaning to get away from the city for a while. Work had been dragging on, and the noise, the lights, the endless pace of everything had started to grind me down. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a few days out in the woods with no cell service, no traffic, no people. I had an old tent, a basic camping stove, some dehydrated meals, and a couple jugs of water. Nothing special. I found a place on a topo map where a small river cut through a deep section of forest about 3 hours from town. It wasn't a park, not even official forest land, just a chunk of state-owned property that hardly anyone visited. There weren't any trails listed, but you could see a logging road that ended about a mile from the river. I packed up the night before, tossed my gear into the back of my car, and headed out just after sunrise. The last few miles of the road were rough, more potholes than pavement, but I didn't mind. I wasn't in a rush. I parked at a wide turnoff near where the old road faded into brush, locked up, and started walking with my pack on. It was early fall, the air cool but dry, and the trees were just starting to turn. I followed the overgrown path down until it disappeared completely, then navigated by compass and map toward the river. Took about an hour and a half, weaving around fallen logs and pushing through underbrush, before I heard the water. It was a quiet sound, but steady. The river wasn't wide, maybe 15 feet across, but it moved fast and clean over rocks and gravel. There was a small flat area a few steps up from the bank, just big enough for my tent. Perfect. I set up camp, rolled out my sleeping bag, and gathered enough wood to last the night. I even made a little fire ring from rocks nearby, not that I planned to keep a big fire going, just enough for some warmth. The river's sound was constant, and there was something calming about it. I spent the afternoon walking along the bank, finding animal tracks in the mud, watching birds hop between branches. There was no signal, no human noise, no trash. I liked that. I felt like I had stepped out of everything, just for a little while. That night, I made soup over the fire and sat in my camp chair until the stars came out. There were no city lights to block them. It was like someone had spilled salt across a black table. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next day was more of the same. Slow, peaceful, quiet. I followed the river upstream a mile or so, just to explore. Found a bend where it widened out into a clear pool, surrounded by flat stones. I took off my boots and soaked my feet, then laid back and just watched the clouds. Nothing happened, and that was the best part. By evening, I was back at camp, cooking again, writing in my small notebook. I had brought a book, too, but mostly I just sat and listened to the world breathing around me. It was the third night when things changed. I had gone to sleep around 10, maybe earlier. The fire had burned down to orange embers. My sleeping bag was warm, and the sound of the river had been enough to lull me into that deep, still sleep that you can only get after a day in the woods. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but I knew immediately that something felt wrong. It was like a pressure in the air, something quiet but heavy, the kind of thing you can't name but you feel in your gut. I didn't move right away, just lay there with my eyes open, staring at the tent ceiling. The river was still running, but quieter somehow, like the whole world had pulled back a little. I strained my ears. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things, but then I heard it. Something moving, slowly, just outside the tent. It wasn't an animal, not a squirrel or raccoon. The steps were too deliberate. They weren't heavy, not stomping or crashing, but they were steady, padded, maybe like someone trying not to make noise but not doing a great job of it. I held my breath. The footsteps circled, slow and wide, like someone was walking around the edge of my camp. Then they stopped. I didn't have a weapon, not really. Just a knife in my backpack and a small hatchet I used for wood. Both were outside the tent. That didn't make me feel great. I stayed still, listening. My mouth was dry. A few seconds passed. Then I heard it again, crack, crunch, barely audible over the river, but definitely there. The sound of a foot pressing down on dry leaves. Then another. Then nothing. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I unzipped the bag just enough to slide my arm out and reach for the flashlight near my head. I clicked it on. The tent lit up inside, the shadows sharp and thin. I listened again. Nothing. Slowly, I unzipped the door flap just a couple inches and looked out. My fire had gone completely out. The trees stood still, black against the sky. I couldn't see anyone. No movement, no sound. I sat there, half in the tent, flashlight off now, ears wide open. But whatever it had been, it was gone. Eventually, I zipped up the tent again and lay back down, though I didn't really sleep after that. I dozed on and off until the sky started to lighten. When the sun came up, I got up fast. I walked a wide circle around camp, looking for footprints or broken branches. Anything that might explain what I heard. There wasn't much. The leaves had shifted in a few places, but it was hard to tell what was normal. Could have been a deer, maybe. That's what I told myself. Curious deer. But I had camped plenty of times. I knew the difference between a deer stepping once and moving on, and something slowly circling your camp. I tried to shake it off. Made coffee, ate a protein bar, packed a day bag, and headed further upstream, hoping that moving around would help settle me. The day was quiet again, but not in the same peaceful way as before. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for twigs snapping. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I cut my hike short and returned by late afternoon. When I got back, I noticed something right away. My camp chair had been moved. It was about 3 feet from where I left it, tilted slightly. I hadn't done that. I was sure of it. My bag was closed, but the zipper looked slightly off. I opened it and checked. Nothing was missing. My notebook, my headlamp, even the granola bars were all there. But everything felt a little touched. I checked the rest of my gear. My food bag, hung from a branch, was untouched. Nothing obvious had happened, but it felt wrong. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold food, sat still as the sun went down, and watched the trees. No sounds, no footsteps, just the river. I got in my tent early, with the hatchet and flashlight beside me this time. Again, I lay still, waiting for sleep, but it never came. Every little rustle outside made my heart pick up. Sometime around midnight, I heard something again. This time, it was closer. The footsteps were slow and soft, but they stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Not heavy, not exaggerated. Just slow, steady breathing. Not mine. It was maybe 2 feet from the fabric wall, just standing there. I didn't move. My flashlight stayed off. My hand clenched the hatchet, but I didn't want to unzip the tent. Didn't want to show I was awake. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then, just as slow as it had come, it moved away. In the morning, I got up fast and packed everything. I didn't even eat. I shoved my gear into my pack, took down the tent in record time, and started hiking out. I didn't look back. The underbrush scraped my arms, but I didn't stop. My heart was pounding the whole way. When I reached the road and saw my car, I felt something crack inside me, like I had been holding my breath for 2 days and could finally exhale. I tossed my gear into the back, locked the doors, and drove. It wasn't until I was back on the main road, 30 miles from the woods, that I finally pulled over and sat in silence. I thought about the chair, the bag, the breathing. It wasn't an animal. I don't know who was out there. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone living off-grid, maybe just a weirdo passing through. But they knew I was there. They had watched me, got close enough to breathe outside my tent. They didn't take anything, didn't hurt me, didn't say a word. But they were there. I didn't go back to that spot. In fact, I didn't go camping at all for months. Even now, when I do, I stick to known trails, marked campgrounds, places with people around. I still love the woods. I love the quiet, but I don't pretend anymore that being alone out there is always peaceful. Sometimes it is, but sometimes someone else is out there too. Not a bear, not a ghost, just a person. And not every person you meet in the woods is someone you want to meet. And the scariest part? They didn't do anything. They didn't need to. Just knowing they were there, close enough to touch my tent in the middle of the night, that was enough. That was worse than any scream or threat. It was quiet, deliberate, and real. I walked into the forest just after noon, carrying my backpack and aiming for a small clearing I had spotted on a map. It was that sweet spot where the sun sliced through the pine branches. The air smelled of resin and damp earth, and the moss was soft like carpet. I needed that place for the weekend. Just me, my tent, my gear, nothing else to distract me. No stories, no urban routine. A real escape into the forest wilderness. I set up camp near a creek, the water low but moving, filling the space with a constant hush. I picked a spot where the creek made a sharp turn, forming a little pool. It looked safe, and I figured I'd use the water later for coffee and cooking. I cleared a patch of leafy debris, drove the tent stakes in, and then gathered firewood from fallen branches and dry pine needles. By late afternoon, I had a fire going and coffee brewing in the little pot. I drank it slow, savoring the taste and warmth, eyes on the flames. A few squirrels chattered nearby, flitting up trees. A woodpecker tapped rhythmically. Nothing strange yet, just forest life. As dusk crept in, I cooked ramen noodles, dropping soy sauce and spices into the pot. Steam rose in purple gold twilight. I glanced around, trees blurrier in the shade, shadows deepening. I ate slowly, thinking of the trek I'd do tomorrow. I smoothed pine needles into neat piles, built a modest fire ring, and set out my flashlight, water bottle, and jacket by the tent door. I made a conscious effort to leave everything organized so I could move quickly if needed. I wasn't afraid. I trained for remote hikes, but I respected the forest. Even a small mistake when you're alone can slip into danger. Night came swift. The fire dimmed to coals. I stretched out in my tent, sleeping bag warm, dreams just beginning to form, when I heard it. A twig snapping outside. A loud crack like someone stepping on a stick. I froze. No voices, just that one sound. Then silence. My heart thumped in the sudden stillness. I waited. Nothing. I debated leaving the tent, but figured it must be an animal. Deer, maybe. I closed my eyes tight. Gradually, a quiet shivered through me, like the forest was breathing. I forced myself to drift to sleep. At midnight, I woke. The tent was colder, wind had picked up. I heard crunching again, faint and steady, circling the camp. My heart sped. I listened harder. There was no deer pattern, no bird. This was purposeful movement. I reached for my flashlight but paused. My gloved hand pressed against cool nylon. Should I peek? Should I stay still? Fear clenched me. I watched through the mesh. Nothing. Then deep in the darkness I saw something. Just a shape, low to the ground, moving behind trees. I hit the flashlight switch and clicked it on, beam slicing through the trees. It stopped, pressed to earth, then vanished. Every sound followed me. The creek sounded distant. My breath in the tent sounded too loud. I sat up, zipped up the tent door halfway, and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag. I tried counting my breath, heart stuck in my ears. Eventually I dozed, but the night stayed alive in my bones. At 3 a.m., I bolted upright. A low howl, far but real, ran across the clearing. Not a wolf, no wolves here, but a coyote? Could be, or someone else. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the door wider. The beam leapt around, trees, darkness. No animal, no person, just those twisted shapes. My flashlight flickered. I hit it again, steady light. I watched the tree line for minutes. Nothing. Relieved, I shut the door and hugged my gear. Morning brought sunlight through the mesh. Birds sang. I dressed slowly, coffee brewing. But I was on edge. Sleep was shallow. Hunger gone. I ate cold oatmeal and packed up fast. I didn't want to stay an extra night. I slid the tent into the bag, folded my pad. The creek looked friendly, calm. I scooped water and boiled some. I packed food. Shouldering the pack, I turned from camp. Then the flash of something caught my eye. By the fire ring on a rock, a small footprint. Boot-sized. Clean. I frowned. No hikers had been near. Signs said this site wasn't used in years. I knelt. The dirt was soft from last night's rain. It was fresh. Someone had been here, maybe after I fell asleep. A jagged feeling knotted my throat. I tried to rationalize, maybe a ranger doing surveillance, maybe a hiker scouting. But I'd heard the steps around midnight. And the shape that burned through me. I stared at the print for a long time, then stood. I walked away without looking back. The trek out took twice as long as coming in. My nerves were tight, every stick snapping underfoot, every bird call a threat. I followed the trail map carefully, double-checking each junction. At one low creek crossing, the water had risen slightly overnight. I slipped and landed in cold water, mud seeping into my boot. A normal accident, but I flinched like something was after me. I shivered and pulled myself up. By noon, I spotted my car. Relief washed over me. I set my pack inside, closed the door. I sat in the seat, closed my eyes, heart still racing. Caught my breath. I looked back at the forest edge. It was calm, sun filtering through pines. It would look inviting to someone less uneasy. I drove off slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror until the road curved away. At a little distance, I braked and stopped at a viewpoint, trees rolling in waves. Everything looked peaceful. I could almost believe it was just my imagination, except for the footprints, except for that shape I'd seen. A few hours later, I was home. I unpacked gear, spread it on the garage floor. I cleaned boots, washed sweaty clothes. I even vacuumed the car floor, but a piece of bark stuck in the tread of one boot. I knelt close. It looked familiar, the same pine bark from that clearing. I picked it off and held it upside down. There, pressed in the mud that remained, faint but clear, was a footprint. Same imprint, boot-sized, tread deep in bark. I looked at my watch. It was only 4 p.m. I'd unpacked gear, but I felt no relief. Something had been there with me that night. Someone or something. I thought about the sound of footsteps circling camp, the beam of my flashlight catching movement. I remembered how my skin prickled, the clear print on the forest floor under moonlight, the jagged anger of fear in my chest. I went inside and sat on my couch, boots by the door, bark in my hand. I stared at the living room window. The street was quiet. My house was familiar, yet I felt exposed, as though the forest had reached into me and unsettled something permanent. But the ending is clear. The forest stayed the same, ancient, silent except for creek and wind. I returned to civilization safe with nothing stolen, nothing physically harmed. But I came back changed. I carried the memory of that midnight shape, the howl, the footsteps too deliberate to be dear. The footprint in the bark tied it together. It was stubborn proof that I was not alone, even when I thought I was. And that memory surfaced every time I laced those boots or stepped on a frozen porch in winter. As time passed, the forest called me again. I knew the risk and respect it demanded. I returned once more, and again I camped in the same clearing, watched the creek, breathed pine air. Nothing happened. No footsteps, no midnight shape, just me and the trees. Yet each snap of a twig turned my head. Each wind whisper, a reminder. The forest held its secrets close. And I, wiser now, learned to pack not just gear, but caution and humility. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters. They're the unknown patterns in the woods, the footprints left behind, the shape at the edge of your light. And that's real enough to haunt your nights, even long after you've left the trees behind. We decided to go camping near the lake one summer. It was a spot my siblings and I had been to before, kind of tucked away from the main campground, but still close enough to the restrooms and a small parking area. We liked that it felt more secluded, with trees all around and a narrow footpath that led right down to the water. The lake was calm that afternoon, the sun reflecting off it like a mirror. Birds chirped, bugs hummed. It was one of those warm days where the heat sort of sits heavy in the air but not in a bad way. We set up our tent, a big family-sized one we'd used for years, staked it down, unpacked our food, sleeping bags, and a few lawn chairs. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. We grilled hot dogs for dinner and sat around the small fire we made, just listening to the sounds of the woods. A few other families were nearby, but far enough that it still felt private. The lake was glassy still by nightfall, and the temperature had dropped just enough to make the fire feel good. We stayed up a while, not really talking much, just watching the fire crackle, tossing in pine needles and little sticks now and then. At some point, we turned in, zipping up the tent and stretching out in our sleeping bags. Sometime deep into the night, I woke up to a distant, rolling rumble. At first, it didn't register. I thought maybe a jet flying overhead or someone moving things in their campsite. But the rumble didn't stop, kept going, long and low. Then I saw a quick flicker of light behind my eyelids. A second later, another flash, brighter. The thunder followed again, louder this time. Still a slow roll, but closer. I sat up. Inside the tent, everything was still and quiet, except for the wind starting to pick up. I could hear the leaves rustling outside, and our tent walls gave a little with each gust. I unzipped the sleeping bag halfway and listened. Then came another flash. This one lit up the tent like a camera flash going off in your face. The thunder that followed wasn't a roll this time. It was a crack, sharp, immediate. It rattled through the ground like a hit from underneath. By now, my siblings were up too, just sitting there, nobody saying anything, just listening. The wind had really picked up. You could hear it tearing through the trees, snapping twigs, pushing the branches into each other. Our tent walls swayed and snapped with each gust, and I could feel the pressure change, like the air inside the tent was getting sucked out then shoved back in. One side of the tent was pulling hard, like it wanted to lift. The stakes must have started loosening. The lightning was constant now. It wasn't just bolts striking down, though we saw a few light up the lake like flares. What was stranger was how it kept crawling sideways through the clouds, branching out in all directions. It was almost like watching fireworks behind a thick veil of smoke. Just endless bursts of light crawling, flickering, surging across the sky. And the thunder didn't stop. It just kept roaring, like one continuous sound that went from low to low again, but never really ended. We could feel it in our chests. A bolt slammed down on the far side of the lake, blinding white, and right after that, a boom that I swear felt like it lifted the ground under us. We all flinched, crouched low inside the tent. That's when one of the tent poles bent inward and snapped. Not cleanly either. It made this horrible cracking sound and folded at the middle, collapsing part of the roof. Rain started pounding then, fast and hard. It hit like tiny fists, and it was instantly everywhere. Within seconds, the rain was coming through the seams, dripping onto our bags, pooling on the tent floor. One gust came and pulled the entire side of the tent up off the ground, flapping and snapping like a kite fighting to break free. That was it. We bailed, unzipped the tent, grabbed what we could, and made a run for the car. I remember the wind trying to push us back, the rain hitting so hard it felt like needles on our faces. Dirt and small sticks were whipping through the air. It was hard to see more than a few feet in front of us. The flash of the lightning helped, but it came in blinding bursts. We made it to the car, yanked open the doors, and climbed in soaking wet. Water dripped from our hair and clothes, and we were all breathing hard. I looked back out through the windshield, and through the sheets of rain, I watched our tent fold in on itself like a crushed can and get ripped from the ground completely. It slammed into a tree, wrapped around the trunk, and just stuck there, flapping like a torn flag. Even in the car, it didn't feel safe. The wind was hitting the sides so hard the whole vehicle rocked. Not just little shakes either. Full-body lurches like something big had hit us. The lightning was so close I couldn't tell what was sky and what was ground anymore. There was a bolt every few seconds, and the thunder was a constant, grinding roar that never faded. Everything felt like it was shaking. I remember feeling this strange sort of panic, not the scream and run kind, but the kind where your chest tightens and your hands start to shake, and all you can think about is getting somewhere solid. Somewhere not surrounded by trees ready to fall. Somewhere not next to a wide, flat lake that looked like it was glowing with electricity every time the lightning struck it. We didn't even talk about it. Someone started the engine, and we peeled out of there, headlights cutting through rain and branches. We didn't even bother to see if anyone else was leaving. The road was a mess. Puddles had become small streams. Debris littered the gravel road, and the trees were bending so low they looked ready to break. Took us about 20 minutes to reach our grandpa's house. He lived just outside of town, far enough that we still had to pass through the thick of the woods, but close enough that the roads were better maintained. We pulled into his driveway and just sat in the car for a while, all of us soaked, exhausted, and buzzing from the adrenaline. I don't remember walking inside. I just remember finally being dry, sitting on his old plaid couch, wrapped in a musty quilt, and listening to the storm still roaring outside. We stayed there the rest of the night. Nobody slept much. Every few minutes, the house would rattle, and another round of thunder would pass through. But at least we weren't in a tent anymore. The next morning, the sun was out. Blue skies like nothing had happened. The air smelled clean, almost sweet, but heavy with that wet earth scent that comes after a night of rain. We made coffee and eventually decided to go back and check on the campsite. The road back was a mess. Trees were down in a few spots, and we had to reroute once when a big oak blocked the road entirely. When we got to the campground entrance, part of it was roped off with a sign saying closed. A ranger truck was parked nearby. We asked around, and someone mentioned that a small tornado had passed through during the night. They didn't know exactly when or where it had touched down, but it had caused some damage. Broken trees, a few tents missing or torn apart. One picnic table had been thrown 50 feet and landed upside down. When we reached our spot, the damage was clear. The tent was still wrapped around the tree where it had landed, torn along the seams, poles snapped or missing. Our gear was scattered. One of the lawn chairs had ended up in the water. A plastic food container was embedded in the mud like it had been hammered down. We spent the better part of an hour picking up what we could salvage. Most of it was soaked. A few things were gone entirely. My sleeping bag was just missing. Never found it. We looked in the trees, around the lake, even checked with the ranger station in case someone had turned it in. Nothing. We packed what was left into the car and left. Nobody said much on the way back. It's hard to explain how powerful that storm felt unless you were in it. I've seen lightning before. I've been in rainstorms and bad weather. But that night, it felt like the storm had a weight to it. Like the entire sky had dropped down and was pressing in from all sides. The lightning didn't stop. The thunder didn't stop. The wind sounded like it was tearing holes in the air itself. Everything felt fragile. Even the ground didn't feel solid. I don't scare easy, but I was scared that night. Deep down scared. Not just for myself, but for all of us. It felt like we were at the edge of something we didn't understand. Not ghosts or monsters or anything like that, but the sheer force of nature. The reminder that no matter how comfortable or prepared you think you are, one moment is all it takes for everything to unravel. We haven't camped at that lake since. Not because we think something strange will happen again. Just because after a storm like that, you never quite forget how small you really are. I grew up in a small rural town surrounded by mountains and thick forests. Camping was just part of life, something we did nearly every weekend, no matter the season. Snow, rain, or heat didn't stop us from heading out. By the time I was 16, I'd been on enough trips to know how the woods worked, how the animals moved, and what to expect. Still, there was one camping trip that stuck with me, one that I never really forgot and never really got over, even though it didn't involve anything supernatural or out of the ordinary. It happened on a chilly autumn weekend. Me and a group of friends, 16 to 19 years old, had planned to camp by one of the lakes tucked into the mountains, a few miles from town. There were about 10 of us in total, but only one tent was packed for the entire group. The plan was simple. Most of us would camp near the main group with the tent, and me and my friend Jake decided to break off and camp closer to a better fishing spot about a mile away. We'd both been there before. The spot was on the edge of a clearing, right by a large boulder that loomed like a silent giant against the night sky. The clearing was perfect, a flat space surrounded by tall pine and fir trees, with a small creek running just on the far side of the rocks. The moon was full that night, casting a pale glow over everything, turning the forest silver and shadows deep and long. Because we only had one tent, we decided to build a lean-to against the big boulder. Jake had brought some heavy-duty tarp and rope, so we found some fallen branches and lashed them together, leaning the tarp over it at an angle against the rock face. The boulder was solid and cold to the touch, but it gave us some shelter from the wind. We arranged our sleeping bags underneath and cleared the space of sticks and pine needles as best we could. I set up the fire with some dry wood we had gathered. The crackle and warmth of the flames felt good in the cold mountain air. Jake sat on a log nearby, cleaning his fishing gear and humming softly to himself. It was the kind of quiet that settles deep into your bones, the kind that feels both comforting and a little uneasy at the same time. After the sun dipped below the mountain ridge, the temperature dropped sharply. I zipped up my jacket tight and threw another log on the fire. The smell of pine and burning wood mixed with the crisp, cold air, and the sound of the creek burbling nearby filled the silence. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. As the night deepened, I started feeling that strange prickling sensation, like someone or something was watching us. I'd had it before. Living in these woods, you get used to the idea that eyes are always on you, somewhere out there in the dark. I told myself it was probably a mountain lion. We have plenty around here, and I knew how they behaved. Mostly they keep their distance, curious but cautious. Not something to panic about. Still, I didn't like the feeling. I sat closer to the fire, poking it again to send sparks flying into the night. Jake was starting to nod off, his head bobbing as he leaned back against the rock. I glanced up and around, the flickering light making the trees look alive. Then I saw him. At the edge of the clearing, maybe 80 yards away, under the light of the full moon, there was a figure standing completely still. A man. He wasn't moving, just watching us. At first, I thought it might be one of the other campers who got lost or was coming to find us, but something about him was off. He didn't call out. He didn't wave or step forward. He just stood there, shadowed by the trees but clear enough under the moonlight. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart beat faster, louder in my ears. Couldn't look away. I stared at him, and I'm sure he was staring right back at me. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy between us, broken only by the occasional crack from the fire and the soft rustle of wind through the pine needles. I wanted to call out, to ask if he needed help or who he was, but I couldn't move. I just sat there, gripping my friend's .357 revolver tightly in my lap. It was more out of instinct than anything else. Holding it made me feel less exposed, like I had some control over the situation. After what felt like an eternity, maybe a minute or two, the man slowly turned and walked off in the opposite direction, deeper into the forest. He moved without hurry, without looking back, just disappearing into the shadows where the moonlight didn't reach. I didn't follow. I didn't call after him. I was still frozen, paralyzed by the unknown, by the fact that a stranger had been watching us and then left without a word. I sat back down by the fire and didn't say a word to Jake. I just kept my eyes on the edge of the clearing until the fire died down and I felt the weight of the night press even harder on me. I didn't sleep much after that. I stayed awake, holding the revolver, listening to every sound in the dark. The snap of twigs, the soft footsteps of animals moving through the underbrush, the wind brushing through the branches. Every noise made me jump. Eventually, the sky began to lighten, the stars fading to pale blue as dawn crept over the mountains. The chill in the air softened, and the birds began their morning songs. I finally relaxed, still shaken but relieved that nothing else had come near. When the others woke up and packed up the main camp, Jake and I kept to ourselves a bit longer. We fished quietly by the creek, catching a few trout, but neither of us talked about the man. Looking back, I'm pretty sure the man wasn't dangerous. Maybe he was another camper, someone who wanted to stay alone, or maybe he was just passing through. The woods here are vast and often lonely, and people sometimes walk through at odd hours. I didn't wave or call out because I was terrified and inexperienced. At 16, you don't always know how to handle things like that. Now, I probably would call out, try to figure out what's going on. But back then, I just sat frozen, clutching that revolver like it was a lifeline. Mountain lions, I learned later, aren't something to fear if you understand them. I've had a few encounters since, being stalked by them, even running face to face with one, but they're shy and avoid people when possible. The real unknown is the human side of the woods, the people you don't expect to see. That night taught me that the forest doesn't just have wildlife. It has stories, people, and shadows that don't always make sense. It reminded me that sometimes the scariest thing isn't the animal you know, but the stranger you don't. I remember the first night we set up camp out there in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, like it was yesterday. It wasn't just your average campsite. It was the kind of place where the desert stretched out endless and silent, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind brushing through sparse scrub brush and the occasional cry of some distant coyote. The stars were impossibly bright that night, scattered like shattered glass across a black velvet sky. We had driven hours to get away from the city noise, eager to soak up some real silence and escape the usual distractions. Our group was 5 of us, all friends from way back. People who liked roughing it but weren't exactly wilderness experts. We set up a couple of tents close together near a dry creek bed, not far from a cluster of mesquite trees that offered a little shade during the day. The sun was still dipping below the horizon when we finally got the fire going, roasting some cold cuts and canned beans over the flames. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. The cool night air was a relief after the brutal daytime heat, and the fire felt good against it. We talked and laughed until late, then one by one started slipping into our tents. My tent was the bigger one in the middle, shared with 2 friends. The other 2 had their own tents nearby. We all figured we'd be safe out here, no one around for miles except the wildlife. We did what you usually do when camping. Tried to ignore the noises of the night and convince ourselves the desert was friendly. But it wasn't friendly. I woke up suddenly in the dead of night, the kind of waking where your body jolts before your brain even has time to register anything. There was a sound. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable over the distant wind, but it was there, something sniffing right outside our tent. The sound was slow and deliberate, close enough that my heart started hammering in my chest. My mind immediately jumped to bears or some animal that had wandered into the site. I even thought maybe some dumbass forgot to tie up the garbage bag properly. I looked over at my friends who were still breathing quietly next to me. The sniffing moved away from our tent and toward the one next to ours. I heard the same slow sniffing sound right outside their tent now. It was low, wet sniffs, like an animal poking around, searching for something to eat. Every muscle in me tensed up. I didn't want to look outside. The thought of a bear or mountain lion circling us in the dark was enough to freeze me in place. Then came a whisper. One of my friends grabbed my arm tightly, and I could feel the panic in his grip. Another friend was awake too. We all silently acknowledged it. We were wide awake, aware of the danger just beyond the thin nylon walls of our tents. No one dared move or whisper, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Seconds later, the quiet was shattered by a scream and the sudden sound of someone bursting out of a tent nearby. It was one of our friends who always carried a handgun with him when we camped. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, banging on the side of his tent, trying to scare off whatever was lurking outside. His voice echoed through the desert night, sharp and loud. But the thing outside wasn't an animal. It was a man. I could hear his footsteps pounding against the rocky ground, running off into the darkness. Our friend chased after him, cursing and yelling. It was surreal. The idea that some stranger had been wandering around, rifling through our coolers, digging through our food, and sniffing our tents like some sort of predator was terrifying. The worst part wasn't that we had an animal to deal with, it was that it was a person. Someone out there who wasn't supposed to be. We all scrambled to pack our things as fast as we could. Hands shaking, we tore down tents and shoved gear into bags, throwing everything into the trucks under the sky now beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. None of us spoke much, the shock and adrenaline making it hard to breathe properly. The desert, which had felt so beautiful and peaceful just hours ago, now felt menacing, like it was swallowing us whole. We drove away from that spot faster than any of us had ever driven before. The stranger's face burned into my mind like a nightmare I couldn't shake. A year later, despite everything that happened, we thought maybe that first incident was a one-off. Maybe the guy was some lost drifter or an odd local who had just wandered in. We convinced ourselves it wasn't going to happen again, and foolishly decided to return to the same general area. This time, though, we thought we'd be smarter. Instead of camping in tents, we all decided to sleep inside our trucks and SUVs. The reasoning was simple and stupid. There's no way someone would get close enough to sniff around a locked vehicle, right? We parked the trucks in a loose circle, the engines off, the faint smell of leather and gasoline mixing with the desert air. The ground was hard and rocky, and the cold night air seeped in through the cracked windows. My girlfriend and I sprawled out in the back of my SUV, blankets pulled up to keep warm. I fell asleep pretty quickly, the exhaustion from the day catching up to me, but I was suddenly woken by something strange. A bright beam of light right in my face. The kind of light that cuts through the dark and makes your pupils shrink down to pinpricks. My first instinct was to wake up and yell at whoever was shining it, but something in me froze. I knew if I reacted, I'd give away that I was awake. So I lay still, pretending to be asleep, heart pounding in my ears. I glanced over at my girlfriend beside me. She was still breathing steadily, eyes closed, asleep or pretending to be. Outside, all I could hear was the soft crackling of the fire and one of my friends snoring by the campfire a little ways off. The light lingered, moving slowly from my face to the next truck in the circle, shining on whoever was inside. I could hear quiet footsteps, the crunch of dry brush under shoes. My skin prickled, every nerve screaming to move, to wake someone up, but I kept still, hoping the person would just go away. When I finally dared to peek, I saw an older man standing there. He was just standing, staring at us while we lay there. His face was hard to make out fully in the low light, but his eyes seemed cold and unreadable. The desert around us was silent except for the fire and his slow breathing. The man's presence was completely out of place, like a shadow that didn't belong. I waited, holding my breath, as he moved on to the next vehicle. When he finally left the campsite and the light vanished into the dark, I scrambled out of my truck and woke my friends. Most of them had been pretending to sleep too, all of us caught in the same mix of fear and relief. The sense of violation was overwhelming. This wasn't just a scary story, it was real. We didn't stick around after that. We packed everything up fast, loaded into our vehicles, and left the desert behind once again. This time, nobody wanted to go back. That night, and the first one too, left me with a clear lesson that I haven't forgotten. There are some places, especially in the vast empty spaces of the desert, where you're not truly alone. It's not the wilderness that's the problem or the animals. It's people who think the silence and isolation mean they can get away with whatever they want, no one watching or caring. Those trips were supposed to be an escape, a way to get away from everything. Instead, they reminded me how vulnerable we really are when there's no one around except the desert and someone watching you from the dark. No fairy tales, no ghosts, just the raw reality of a stranger sneaking through your camp, sniffing around your food, and staring at you as you lie there trying to pretend you're asleep. So, if you ever find yourself thinking about camping out in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, just remember that sometimes the scariest thing isn't the desert or the animals that live there. It's the people who come in the night, unseen and unwanted, and remind you that safety isn't guaranteed anywhere. Because out there, the night doesn't just hide the stars. It hides a whole lot more, and sometimes it's best to keep your eyes wide open. That camping trip with my wife is one I still think about sometimes, especially when the wind starts to pick up. We'd chosen a spot deep in a jack pine forest. Those trees with their tall, skinny trunks and dense, spiky green needles. The kind of place that feels alive, but also a little fragile, like the trees themselves are holding their breath in the wind. We got there in the early afternoon, just enough time to set up camp before nightfall. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that's heavier than just silence, like it was waiting for something to happen. We pitched the tent on a small patch of flattened earth, surrounded by thick jack pines that stood too close for comfort. The smell of pine resin was thick in the air, that sharp, sticky scent that makes you feel like you're far away from everything. I stacked some firewood nearby while my wife arranged the gear inside the tent. The wind was calm at first, just a gentle rustle through the needles. We started a small fire and sat close, cooking dinner over the flames. The sky was clear, and the stars were bright, poking through the dark canopy above. It was peaceful, almost perfect. Then, sometime after dark, it started. The wind changed, not just a little breeze, but a sudden, harsh gust that howled through the trees. The branches above started to sway, heavy limbs creaking and groaning as they bent under the pressure. At first, it was just the sound of leaves and needles brushing against each other, but then it grew louder, like the whole forest was screaming. I remember looking up and seeing branches snapping off, some as thick as my arm, crashing down to the ground nearby. The tent shook violently, the stakes struggling to hold it down. My wife grabbed my hand tightly, her face pale but calm. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. We both knew we had to ride it out, but it felt like the forest was trying to tear itself apart. The jack pines, with their brittle wood, were no match for the storm. I could hear trees falling in the distance, the thud and crack echoing through the night. At one point, a giant pine toppled close enough that the ground shook. The wind ripped at the tent fabric, flapping it like a sail caught in a storm. We huddled close, heartbeats racing, waiting for the worst. The storm lasted for hours. By the time it finally died down, the forest was changed. Branches littered the ground, some whole trees uprooted, others broken halfway up their trunks. The air was thick with the smell of fresh pine sap and dirt churned by the fallen trees. We spent the next morning walking through the wreckage, marveling at the power of that night. It was scary, pure, raw nature, but there was no magic or mystery in it, just the harsh reality of the wild. That trip always reminds me how small you really are out there, how quickly things can turn dangerous, and how little control we have when nature decides to show its strength. Another time, I went camping with my best friend to a spot we found a few years back. It was semi-remote, somewhere that wasn't far from civilization but far enough that only a 4x4 could reach it without trouble. The road was rough, filled with ruts and loose gravel, winding through thick forest. This spot had some signs of previous campers, a couple of fire pits, some old picnic tables rotting away, and a dilapidated outhouse that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The parks department apparently checked on the place maybe once a year, just enough to keep it from falling apart completely. We pulled in mid-afternoon and started unpacking. My buddy wandered over to the outhouse. There were two of them side by side, both wooden and clearly falling apart. He opened the first one, paused, then shut the door. He went to the second one, disappeared inside for a few minutes, then came back. He motioned for me to check the first one again. I shrugged, expecting something gross like someone had left trash or maybe an animal had died in there. What I found was weirder than anything I expected. Inside the first outhouse were 3 huge backpacks, the kind you'd use for week-long hiking trips. Big, heavy-duty bags, not cheap or flimsy ones. We looked inside, curious. 2 of them were full of decent camping gear. Tents, sleeping bags, cooking supplies, clothes, nothing out of place, just good quality stuff left behind. But the third bag was something else entirely. It was filled with nothing but Skittles. Bags and bags of Skittles in every flavor you could imagine, tropical, sour, original, bulk packages, small snack sizes. The entire thing was packed tight with candy. It was surreal. Why would anyone pack 80 liters worth of Skittles and leave them in an abandoned outhouse in the woods? Neither of us could come up with a logical explanation. We speculated about maybe a stash from someone who ran out of time or got spooked, but the whole thing just didn't make sense. We didn't touch the bags more than we had to. We left them where they were but made sure to tell the park rangers about it once we got back to civilization. The whole time we camped there, for days in all, we never saw another soul. The place was eerily quiet except for the usual sounds of the forest. The Skittles bags sat quietly in the outhouse, an unsolved mystery we could only shake our heads at. One more story that still gives me chills was a spontaneous backpacking trip with my dog. It wasn't far from the road, just a quick overnight trip to get away from everything. I brought a simple tarp for shelter and a small fire going. We picked a spot tucked away behind some trees, not hidden exactly, but low-key enough not to draw attention. I was dozing off, listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional bark from my dog, when suddenly I heard a truck ripping through the area. It was loud, like it came out of nowhere, with a bunch of drunken voices shouting. I sat up, tense, watching shadows flicker as the headlights passed close by. Then came the shooting, gunshots ringing out in quick succession. I froze. They probably had no idea I was there, parked on a different road, and I hadn't realized how close I was to where they were driving and shooting. But it was terrifying. The sound of guns firing in the woods, especially so close, is something you don't forget. Based on the terrain, I was pretty sure some of those shots were aimed in my direction, or at least dangerously close. I grabbed my dog's leash, pulling it tight. The adrenaline kicked in hard. I packed up quickly, not bothering to hide anything or finish what I was doing. I moved fast, taking the most direct route out without making noise, my heart pounding the whole way. The drunk shooters kept yelling and firing as I slipped away, but I didn't stop to look back. Once I was safely back on the main road, with the noise fading behind me, I sat in the car for a long while, trying to calm down. That night reminded me how unpredictable the outdoors can be. Not just nature, but people too. Camping can be peaceful, but sometimes it shows you just how real and raw the world is. It's not about ghosts or stories. It's about the wind that can tear down trees, the strange mysteries left behind by other campers, and the danger that can come from other people. Those trips stay with me because they were real, and sometimes reality is scarier than any tale you could imagine. The sun had barely risen when we gathered in front of my house, ready for our annual camping trip. It was the 1st of May, the day we always marked for our tradition, and this year was no different. We'd been planning it for weeks, each of us contributing to the usual haul of food, drinks, and camping gear. As always, a few of us stopped by the convenience store to grab some beer for the road. The plan was simple: head to the same camping spot we'd been to a dozen times, deep in the woods, set up camp, and drink until the sun went down. It was the kind of trip where we could just let loose, have fun, and forget about everything else for a while. By 5 a.m., everyone was packed into the car, bags full of stuff, and our spirits were high. It was still chilly outside, and the sun hadn't quite come up yet, but it didn't matter. We were used to the early mornings, the long drive, and the excitement of reaching our destination. It was tradition, and no matter what, we kept it. We drove through the countryside, the roads lined with the kind of greenery that always made me feel at ease. We passed the town and headed further out, deeper into the forest. When we finally reached the campsite, it was still relatively quiet. A few other cars were parked nearby, people unloading their gear and setting up their own spots. But we didn't pay them much attention. Everyone else was there for the same thing, enjoying the outdoors and having a good time. The sun was starting to warm the air as we set up our tents. We got a fire going, the smoke rising into the clear sky, and cracked open the first beers of the day. As usual, the whole group was in high spirits, laughing, joking, and just enjoying the moment. The spot we picked was nestled in the woods, just far enough from the other campers to feel like we had some privacy. But even so, we could still hear faint music in the distance from the other side of the campsite. It was nothing unusual, just some people playing music to keep themselves entertained, like we were. Hours passed. The day turned into late afternoon, and we found ourselves with empty cans scattered around the campfire. The music from the other campers had been playing pretty steadily throughout the day, but as the sun started to dip behind the trees around 7 or 8 p.m., the music suddenly stopped. First, we thought nothing of it. We figured the people near us were just winding down for the night, maybe getting some sleep. It wasn't uncommon for people to pack up and leave on the night of May 1st, since most of them were only there for the day. But we were staying for the whole weekend. Around that time, one of my friends, Jake, said he was going to go over and ask if anyone had a lighter. We'd forgotten to bring one, and he thought it wouldn't hurt to check with the nearby campers. He wandered off in the direction of where the music had been, but when he came back a few minutes later, he looked kind of surprised. "They're gone," he said, shaking his head. "I went over there, and no one's around. Everything's packed up. They must have left early." We all stood there for a moment, trying to process what he said. It didn't make sense. Normally, people stuck around at least until the 2nd of May, and we'd never seen anyone leave that early. But we shrugged it off. Maybe they just had somewhere else to be. Jake found a lighter and we got the fire going again. It was starting to get dark now, the kind of dark where the trees almost swallowed up the light, and the air had that cool, crisp edge to it. We cracked open more beers and kept talking, trying not to think too much about the weirdness of the situation. The night carried on as normal, the sound of our laughter and conversation filling the space around us. But around 10 p.m., something changed. We heard it at first, a faint sound off in the distance, something like a giggle, the high-pitched laughter of girls playing in the woods. It wasn't unusual to hear people messing around in the dark, but the way it sounded made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't sound like normal laughter. It was distorted, like something was off. And it wasn't just the laughter. We started hearing footsteps. Quick, light steps, like someone was running through the forest. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. It didn't make sense. There was no one around, and even if there had been, no one would have been running like that in the woods. Felt wrong. What the hell was that? Someone asked. It's probably just some drunk people screwing around, Jake said, trying to brush it off. Let's just keep drinking. We passed the beers around again, the laughter coming easier now as we tried to ignore the strange sounds. But the noises didn't stop. The running footsteps grew closer, and the laughter kept echoing through the trees, each time a little more distant, but still there. We'd drunk enough to feel pretty buzzed by now, but that didn't stop the fear from creeping in. Something didn't sit right about it. At this point, everyone was on edge, trying to act casual but feeling uneasy. The air around us felt thicker, like the forest had become a different place altogether. Then, we heard something even worse. Footsteps, heavy ones, coming towards us from the trees. They weren't fast or light like the running from earlier. These were slow, deliberate steps, like someone or something was walking toward us. Everyone immediately tensed up. We grabbed anything we could find, shovels, knives, sticks, and we prepared ourselves. We didn't know what we were going to face, but we weren't going to be caught off guard. But nothing came. The footsteps stopped just outside the clearing. We waited, hearts pounding in our chests, the crackling fire the only sound in the air. I swear, for a moment the whole forest went quiet. There was no sound of wind, no rustling of leaves, just absolute silence. The air felt charged, like something was about to happen. But then, the silence was broken by a snap of a twig somewhere to our left. We all jumped, our eyes darting to the darkness. We stood there for a long time, listening. The footsteps didn't return. It wasn't until we started to settle down again that we heard them once more, coming from the edge of the camp. They were getting closer. We all stood up, ready to fight whatever was out there. But again, nothing came. The footsteps stopped just out of view, and no one emerged. We kept quiet, waiting in the dark. We knew there was something out there, but whatever it was staying just far enough away that we couldn't see it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps, the laughter, everything. It all went quiet. By the time we decided to try to get some sleep, we were all exhausted, but the tension in the air didn't let up. We lay in our tents, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the only thing that kept us from thinking too much about what had happened. Still, no one slept well that night. Every little noise had us on edge. A branch breaking, a distant snap of a twig. It all made us jump. When the morning came, we were all awake before the sun even rose. We were too afraid to stay in the tents any longer, and we all piled out, looking around. But there was no sign of anyone. No one had been there. The campsite was as quiet as it had been when we first arrived, and the tracks we thought we'd seen in the ground were gone. We looked for signs of whoever or whatever had been around us, but there was nothing. No footprints, no traces, just the quiet of the forest. As we packed up to leave, none of us said much. We all knew what we had experienced, and though we couldn't explain it, we were all shaken. That night, whatever had been in the woods with us wasn't human, and we were lucky that it didn't come any closer. To this day, we've never talked about it much. Maybe we were all just drunk, maybe we heard things that weren't there, but something happened that night, and none of us will ever forget it. Even now, I can't help but wonder if we were just a little too close to something we shouldn't have been. It was supposed to be a simple Girl Scout trip. Nothing too serious, nothing too out of the ordinary. Just a weekend camping trip with a bunch of my classmates. All of us in our junior high uniforms, ready for a little outdoor adventure. My school had set it up, and to be honest, I wasn't expecting much more than the usual. A little hiking, a campfire, maybe some ghost stories, nothing that would stick with me forever. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon, a large open area in the middle of a military base. The base was old, probably decades old, with a few weathered buildings scattered around, but it had that kind of charm that old places have. The trees surrounding us were tall and dense, their branches thick enough to block out most of the sky, and the air smelled fresh, like pine and earth. I remember the sounds too, the wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional distant clank of something metal, probably from the old equipment left behind. The day was a blur of activities. Some of us worked on knots, others learned to cook over a fire, and then there were those who spent time hiking around the area. It wasn't until later that evening, just as the sun was setting and the air started to cool, that things started to feel different. Our supervisor, Ms. Hartley, a tall woman with short, dark hair and a no-nonsense attitude, gathered us all together. She told us it was time for a night walk through the forest trail. Everyone was a bit reluctant. I mean, we were all a bit uneasy in the dark, but it wasn't the dark itself that was the problem. It was the stories. Ms. Hartley was famous for telling creepy stories to get us hyped up, but she really went all in this time. The quality of the microphone she used was awful. Static crackled and distorted most of what she said, but she still managed to get her point across. I don't remember all of it, but there was something about soldiers from the old military base, how they used to patrol these woods, and how some of them never came back. There were stories about strange sounds in the night, and how some people thought they saw things moving just outside the range of their flashlights. It wasn't exactly terrifying, but it was enough to make everyone feel a little uneasy, especially since we were walking through the woods at night, with only our flashlights to guide the way. We began our hike, a long line of girls walking silently, the only sounds being our footsteps crunching against the forest floor and the occasional murmur from someone ahead of me. I stayed near the back of the group, mostly because I wasn't in the mood to be close to anyone. Besides, the further I was from the front, the less I could hear of the ongoing conversation. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the trail ahead, the flickering beams of light dancing in front of my feet. But then something happened that threw me off. A scream, a loud, sharp scream that echoed through the trees. The girls in the front of the line jumped back in panic, their voices rising in a chorus of whispers and gasps. We all froze for a second, waiting for something, anything to happen. My heart started racing. Was it one of the stories Ms. Hartley had told us? Was it one of the soldiers she mentioned coming back to haunt us? I felt a chill run down my spine. Then, from up ahead, someone shouted, "It's okay. It's just me." It was Ms. Hartley. She had somehow disappeared from the front of the group and was now standing at the far side of the path. I don't know how she got there, or when exactly she left her position, but she was standing in front of us, smiling. We all sighed in relief. A few of the girls let out nervous laughs. "You scared the hell out of us," someone called out, half laughing, half shaken. "I didn't mean to," Ms. Hartley called back. She sounded amused, but also a little apologetic. "But it's all part of the adventure, right?" At that point, we all shrugged it off. It was just a little scare, nothing to worry about. We'd split up after that, heading towards the meeting point near the campfire. But the whole group was still a bit on edge. There were jokes and giggles, but I noticed something strange as we walked. Ms. Hartley was with us again, but something didn't feel right. Maybe it was because she had just appeared out of nowhere, or maybe it was the way she looked at us. But there was this lingering feeling in the air that I couldn't shake. When we finally reached the meeting point, we saw another supervisor standing there, Ms. Hartley's colleague, a woman named Mrs. Daniels. She was standing near the fire, looking completely calm, as though she had been there for a while. But that wasn't what caught everyone's attention. The weird part was Ms. Hartley was still with us. She was standing near the back of the group, chatting quietly with one of the girls, as though she had never left. The girls who had been talking to her before froze. They turned to Mrs. Daniels, then back to Ms. Hartley. A few of them started to whisper, exchanging confused looks. "Didn't Ms. Hartley just show up with us?" one of them asked. "Wasn't she ahead of us the whole time?" We all started talking amongst ourselves, wondering if we had missed something. The whole thing seemed strange, like a trick or some sort of prank. But why would she play a prank on us? It didn't make sense. "Wait a minute." One of the girls spoke up, turning to Ms. Hartley. "When did you get here? How did you end up with us?" Ms. Hartley laughed, brushing it off like it was nothing. "Oh, I've been here for a long time now. You must not have noticed." We all stared at her, unsure of what to say. No one knew what to make of it. Why had she said that? And if she'd been there for a while, why hadn't anyone seen her earlier? The conversation died down, and some of us wandered off to sit around the campfire. Others went to get something to drink, still talking in hushed voices. It felt like a strange shift in the atmosphere, like something wasn't quite right, but we couldn't put our finger on it. Then, as the night wore on, a few of us went back to Ms. Hartley, asking her more about what had happened. We were still curious, even though we didn't really expect an answer. She told us that she hadn't left the spot we had last seen her. In fact, she had been there the entire time. She looked at us, confused, as if we had misunderstood. "But we saw you earlier," one of my friends insisted. "You were with us at the front of the group and then you weren't. You popped up later like you were following us." Ms. Hartley shook her head. "No, I've been right here. I don't know what you're talking about." It didn't make sense. It was like she was denying the fact that she'd been somewhere else just a few minutes ago. Was she messing with us? But why would she? This wasn't the time for pranks. We were on a serious trip, not some joke at the expense of our nerves. The conversation ended, and eventually, we all split up to head to our tents. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about it. What if Ms. Hartley wasn't lying? What if something had happened, and we didn't see it? Maybe she had been there all along, and we just hadn't noticed. Maybe we'd all been caught up in the moment, the excitement and tension of the hike, and our brains had just played tricks on us. But it was hard to shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the kind of thing that could easily be explained away. Something about the way Ms. Hartley had acted, the way she had just appeared, felt strange. Maybe it was a simple misunderstanding. Maybe we were just overthinking it. But then again, what if we weren't? I was alone in the woods. Nothing unusual for me, really. I'd spent the weekend at the same campground before, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the trees and the occasional sound of a bird or a squirrel darting across the underbrush. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, just me and the wilderness for a few days to get away from everything. The kind of place where you can let your guard down, forget the noise of the world, and just be. The campsite was nestled in a quiet valley, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush, with a stream running just beyond the trees. I had set up my tent near a clearing, away from the main trail. I didn't mind the isolation. It gave me peace of mind, the kind of peace you can only find when you're far from civilization, where there are no people and no distractions, just the sounds of nature. The sun was low in the sky when I arrived, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I spent the evening collecting firewood and getting everything ready for the night. As the light faded and the fire grew, I cooked a simple meal, sitting close to the warmth of the flames. It was quiet, too quiet. You know, that kind of silence where the sounds of nature seem distant, like they're not quite there? It was one of those nights. No rustling in the trees, no chirping of crickets, just the crackle of the fire. I sat there watching the flames dance and shift, and I felt that nagging sensation at the back of my mind, the kind you get when something feels off, even if you can't place what it is. It wasn't the first time I had spent a night alone in the woods, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the stillness of the place, the way the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Or maybe it was the fact that I was alone, really alone, for the first time in a long while. I shook the feeling off, thinking I was just being paranoid. After eating, I decided to take a walk. It had been a while since I'd gotten out to explore the area. My mind was restless, and a walk always seemed to clear things up. I grabbed my flashlight and a jacket, and I set off down the narrow trail that led away from the campsite. The air had a chill to it, a crispness that made me pull my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The path was well worn, and the trees formed a dense canopy overhead, blocking out most of the moonlight. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of the trail in front of me. I walked for about 20 minutes, just lost in the quiet of the forest, when I noticed something odd. There was a slight disruption in the underbrush to the side of the trail. Something looked out of place, like the foliage had been disturbed. Caught my attention, but it wasn't anything that would have set off alarms. Still, something in me urged caution, so I approached slowly, keeping my flashlight pointed down to get a better look. When I pushed through the branches, that's when I saw him. At first, it didn't register. I just thought it was some animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but then the flashlight beam landed on him, and my heart skipped a beat. He was lying there in a crumpled heap, face down. The body was sprawled across the forest floor, arms twisted unnaturally to the sides. His legs were splayed awkwardly, one bent at a strange angle. I froze. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. I took a step back, then another. This wasn't right. This wasn't an animal, not even close. It was a person, a man, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, dressed in a t-shirt and jeans that were torn in places, as if he had been dragged through the underbrush. His skin had a sickly, pale hue to it, and his face was streaked with dirt, his eyes wide open but glazed over. There was no sign of life in him. His mouth was slightly open, and there was something dark around his lips, a dried, crusted substance that I didn't want to think about. My breath caught in my throat, and my mind raced. I had no idea who he was or how long he had been there. My first instinct was to turn around and run back to camp, but something held me in place. I couldn't just leave him there. I had to make sure he wasn't still alive, that he wasn't just unconscious. But I knew deep down that was a lie I was telling myself. He was gone. I knelt down beside him, cautiously, trying not to touch anything. The forest seemed to press in around me, the air thick with the scent of decay. It wasn't just the body. It was the smell of something foul, something that had been left to rot in the damp earth for too long. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I reached out, hesitating just a moment before gently pushing his shoulder with the tip of my flashlight. His body was cold, colder than it should have been. He had been there for a while. I stood up quickly, a chill running down my spine. It was hard to think, hard to focus. The only thing I knew for sure was that I needed to get out of there. I needed to get back to camp and call for help. But there was one thing I couldn't shake. The way he had been left, sprawled out like that so deliberately. It wasn't just a random death. It looked like he had been placed there. Someone had done this. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run, but I couldn't. I had to make sure it wasn't someone I knew. Maybe he was just lost, an unfortunate soul who had wandered into the woods and collapsed. But something told me it wasn't that simple. I couldn't just walk away. The path back to camp felt longer than it should have, the shadows in the trees shifting and stretching as if they were following me. The flashlight in my hand trembled, the beam wavering with every step. I was starting to panic, my breath coming in short gasps. I tried to keep calm, but my mind was filled with questions. Most of them I didn't want to answer. Who was he? What happened to him? And why the hell was he out here alone? When I finally reached the clearing, I ran straight to my tent, heart pounding, and locked the zipper behind me. I didn't care that it was just me out here. I didn't care that it was dark. I couldn't shake the image of that man's lifeless body lying in the woods. I sat in my tent for what felt like hours, too afraid to go back and investigate further, too terrified to sleep. The night dragged on, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. Eventually, the sun began to rise, and I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay there another minute. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my hands shaking the entire time. The forest outside was eerily quiet, the same quiet that had unsettled me the night before. I walked to my car, keeping my eyes on the trail, half expecting to see something or someone moving in the shadows. It wasn't until I was safely in my car, driving away, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I navigated the winding road that led out of the woods. I couldn't get the image of that man out of my head, nor could I stop thinking about how his body had been so carelessly discarded in the forest, like a piece of trash left to rot. I didn't go to the authorities. I didn't report it. Couldn't. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen. I didn't have the words. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the thought that, in the end, it wouldn't have mattered. I'd seen enough death in my life to know that sometimes things happen, and you're left to deal with the consequences. But that's the thing about the woods. They hold secrets. They don't let go of things easily. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try to forget, those secrets find their way to you. Every summer, my church group would go camping together for 2 weeks. It wasn't some spiritual retreat or anything. We weren't constantly praying or doing church activities. It was just a chance for us to be together in the woods, to bond over hikes, games, and the peace that came from being away from everything. We were a group of people who, despite not having much in common, somehow found connection through these trips. And it had become a tradition. I was 16 at the time, the oldest in our group. I was used to being the one who looked out for others, though I didn't always like it. I guess that's just what happens when you're the oldest. It becomes your role whether you want it or not. The younger kids looked up to me, and the counselors often relied on me to keep an eye on the others. I didn't mind. I'd been going on these trips since I was a kid, and I was familiar with every rock, every tree, and every trail in the area. 1 week into our trip, the counselors decided to play a game. They set up stations throughout the woods, each with its own mini-challenge. The idea was to walk through the forest, stopping at each station to complete a task. Some of the tasks were simple, like throwing a ball into a target or balancing on a log, while others were more difficult, like climbing over obstacles or carrying heavy items. My group was up first. We started off easy enough, crossing a small creek. It wasn't deep, maybe just knee-high, but it was slippery and had a strong current after the rain the night before. We had to hop across the rocks, making sure we didn't lose our balance and fall into the water. I was in the back, so I watched as the others made it across. I carefully took my time, balancing myself, making sure my feet found solid ground. Once across, we continued our trek, climbing a steep hillside. It was hard work, but nothing I couldn't handle. The hill was long and covered with loose dirt and small rocks that crunched underfoot. I had to pause a couple of times to catch my breath, but eventually, we made it to the top. The next challenge was to carry a tree trunk from one point to another. It wasn't a large trunk, but it was heavy. There were 6 of us, so we took turns carrying it back and forth, trying to see how many times we could do it before we got too tired. It was exhausting. The sun was high, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my back. My muscles were sore, and the air felt thick and heavy. Despite the heat, I pushed through. I didn't want to be the one to complain, the one to slow down the group. Then something happened. As I lifted the trunk for what felt like the 100th time, I twisted my ankle. I didn't even see it coming. 1 second I was steady, the next I was on the ground, clutching my ankle in pain. My first instinct was to try and get up, but I couldn't. A sharp pain shot up my leg, and I immediately realized that something was wrong. I stayed there for a second, hoping that the pain would subside, but it didn't. I tried to put weight on my foot, but I couldn't. I looked up at the group, but they hadn't noticed. They were all focused on the trunk, busy with the task at hand. They were ahead of me, and I was still on the ground, unable to move. I could hear the laughter and voices in the distance, but it felt like I was in my own little world, isolated by the pain. I tried to stand up again, this time more carefully, but the moment my foot hit the ground, the pain surged through me and I collapsed back down. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself not to cry. I was the oldest, I had to be tough. Crying would only make it worse. I couldn't be the one to show weakness. So, I limped to the group, taking it slow, trying not to let them see how much pain I was in. When I finally caught up to them, I collapsed onto the ground and looked at my ankle. It was swollen and it was getting worse by the second. I tried to move it, but the pain was unbearable. My counselor, who was about 17 at the time, walked over. She looked at me with concern, but she didn't say much. She was a little overstrained herself, trying to manage everything and everyone. She didn't know what to do, so she called Mark, our camp leader, to come and look at it. We sat there for what felt like forever, waiting. The rest of the group was still finishing their task, unaware of what was happening with me. I stared at the ground, trying to stay calm, trying not to panic, but my mind was racing. I had to get back to camp, I had to be okay. What if this meant I had to leave? What if my parents found out and I had to go home? I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to disappoint anyone. When Mark finally showed up with another counselor, they both looked at my ankle and decided that they needed to get me down the hill. The other route would have been 2 kilometers long, but the one we took was much shorter, only 5 minutes away by foot. The problem was that I couldn't walk. I was in too much pain to even stand, so they decided to carry me. I don't remember much of the walk down. I think I was in shock. My mind was fuzzy, my body exhausted. I had my eyes closed most of the time, trying to block out everything around me, but the ride was anything but smooth. The path was rocky and uneven, and every bump seemed to send a shock of pain through my body. I could feel the cool breeze against my skin, and I heard the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling, but it all felt so distant. I couldn't concentrate on anything except the throbbing in my ankle. At one point, we came across another group and we stopped to rest. My friend was with that group, and later, she told me that I wasn't responsive at all. I didn't react to anything they said. I just stared straight ahead, blankly. Felt like I was in a dream. Nothing seemed real. The next part of the journey was when I started to panic. We had to cross the creek again, and I knew that wasn't going to happen. The water was moving faster now, and the rocks were slippery. My 2 counselors were exhausted from carrying me, so they switched out with 2 others. I was scared, I'll admit it. I didn't want to fall into that water. I didn't want to make things worse for myself or for anyone else. I just wanted to get to the car, get to the hospital, and know that everything would be okay. Eventually, they managed to get me into the car, and we drove to the nearest hospital. I don't remember much of the drive. I was so focused on the pain in my leg that I didn't really pay attention to anything outside the window. The city was much bigger than the camp area, and it was so different. The noise, the people, the lights. It all felt so overwhelming after the quiet of the woods. At the hospital, they did the usual tests. X-rays, checking my pulse, asking me questions I didn't really want to answer. I just wanted them to fix my ankle. The doctor looked at the results and casually told me that I had torn my cruciate ligament. It was bad, he said. I needed to give myself injections in my belly every day to manage the pain and prevent further complications. I was shocked. I thought it was just a sprain, but it was so much worse. My mind raced. I was going to be stuck on crutches for the rest of the trip, and I felt a heavy sense of guilt. I should have been tougher. I should have been stronger, but there was nothing I could do now. When I returned to camp, I was given crutches to help me get around. It was a strange feeling, being the one who needed help for once. I wasn't used to being dependent on others. The counselors had to carry me sometimes, or help me move from place to place. It was a weird experience. I'd known these guys since I was 11, but being carried like that felt so foreign, so vulnerable. I didn't like it, but I stayed. I stayed for the rest of the week, despite everything. It wasn't easy, but I was determined to finish what I had started. My parents never fully realized how bad my injury was. They thought I was just being dramatic, but it was real. It was terrifying. By the end of the week, I had learned something that I still carry with me to this day. Life is unpredictable. You can be strong one moment and helpless the next. You can't control everything, no matter how much you want to. I learned to accept help when I needed it, to rely on others when I couldn't do it alone. and that's a lesson I'll never forget. I slipped out of the car just as the sun glowed low on the horizon, tossing long shadows between the pine trunks. My pack felt heavy on my shoulders, but I welcomed the weight. It reminded me I'd come prepared. I stepped onto the narrow trail, leaves crackling beneath my boots, and the scent of damp earth and resin filled the air. The forest here was old, towering pines, gnarled roots twisting across the path, and thicker growth as I moved deeper. It was the kind of place that felt alive in a way the city never would. I planned this solo weekend for weeks. Just me, some supplies, and the woods. No phone signal, no noise aside from wind in the trees. I was chasing quiet. Still, as soon as I left the car behind, I realized silence isn't empty. It's full of subtle sounds. The tapping of sap dripping from pine cones, distant birdsong, and somewhere to my left, a low hum that could have been an insect or something bigger. At the clearing, I stopped to set up camp. I chose a small rise, flat and sheltered on three sides by thick brush. I cleared leaves and threw my tarp over the ground. My tent went up easily. I've done this enough. I stacked firewood, built a small circle with rocks, then took a pause. In the faint light, I gathered pine needles to line my sleeping pad. The forest felt peaceful but waiting, as if it held its breath. As twilight deepened, I built the fire. The crackling flames lit the clearing like a modest torch. I cooked pasta in a pot, tasting the warmth and simplicity of food eaten in the open. Dusk stretched long, birds quieted, and the crickets and frogs took over. The forest shifted from warm gold to deep blue. Each snap in the fire sounded louder. I watched embers spiral up and vanish. I remember thinking how small I was in all that space. The trees were taller than I'd ever seen. I imagined how the forest looked centuries ago, before roads or cabins. I felt a kind of calm honesty there, as if the woods knew me better than city walls ever could. Night fell, and I climbed into the tent, still hearing the fire beneath the stove. I unzipped the vestibule to keep the stars in view, thousands of them, scattered like crystal. I tried to sleep, but in that moment between wakefulness and rest, everything sounded unfamiliar. A branch creaked, a distant thump, like falling debris or wildlife moving. I lay still, heart pounding, searching for reason. Probably a deer, probably, but in that darkness, reason doesn't always win. Morning came slow. I didn't hear birds until sunlight touched treetops. I unzipped everything and let the sun filter onto my face. Felt safe again. I brewed coffee over the coals, strong, steaming in the chill. I had bacon, eggs, and granola. Eating like that in the morning felt sacred. I picked a direction and wandered deeper. Moss grew thick on stones, wet from early dew. My boots slipped on roots. A raven croaked overhead. I spotted animal tracks. Raccoon, rabbit, maybe fox. I paused, imagining them slipping through the brush in the night. I followed a deer trail off the main path. It wound through fern and fractal light. I let it lead for nearly an hour, until it ended at a marshy seep, water silent but alive with insects and frogs. I lingered there. I could feel the earth soak into my boots. I pressed my palms on a log and imagined how old the tree must be. Rings counting decades. I thought about how small my life seemed compared to that slow, endless growth. As afternoon slid by, I returned to camp. The fire pit had cooled, but a pile of ash gleamed with small red spots, embers sleeping. I rebuilt the fire, drank water, shaded my eyes with the calendar. No phone, no time. The world had reset to elemental. Sun, wood, water. Then I heard it, that low hum or vibration again, not steady like insects, but irregular. A soft crunch. Someone or something walking quietly, stepping over pine needles. I froze halfway to the fire. Ash fell onto my pack. I squinted into the dim wood. Trees blocked my view. My heart pounded. I thought of camping safety guides, make noise, shout. But instinct said wait. I stayed still, counted my breathing, scanned shadow and light. The sound faded, then returned, footsteps circling the clearing. Then the hum changed pitch, like an animal rustling through the underbrush. I gripped my mug. Heat warmed my palm. I whispered at myself, "It's wildlife, maybe a bear, deer, raccoon, just wildlife. But wild doesn't mean safe." I could imagine all kinds of outcomes. A startled bear, protective of cubs. A mountain lion moving quietly. I imagined fine-tipped paws, low growls, the beam of a headlamp in my face. The footsteps moved off again. I almost stood to investigate, but remembered how easy it is to follow curiosity into danger. Instead, I sat still, firelight flickering. I threw another piece of wood, watched flames leap up. Time stretched thin, then silence. The silence that isn't calm, but loaded, watchful. I listened as wind sifted through branches. A lone woodpecker tapped far off. My pulse slowed. I stroked my mug, breath clouding in the air. Hours passed, and nothing came back. I dried the dishes, fell into a shallow sleep in my chair. When I woke, dawn was crawling under the tent flap. My arms ached, but I felt alive, alert in a way city life never gave. I refilled water, packed slowly. I didn't rush. I slid the tarp onto my back, strapped the tent, and took a final look at the clearing. As I hiked out, logs and stones and fallen pine cones littered the way. Every detail, wood grain, rock moss, spider web, stood out. I felt gratitude and relief in equal parts. The forest felt like a living thing I'd entered and left with respect. Back at the car, I dropped my pack into the trunk, shut the door. My boots were wet, socks muddy, hands rough. I stared at the trees one last time. They were silent, ancient, no sign of last night's visitor. Maybe nothing had happened. Maybe a deer had been curious or something larger had passed through, and I lived through the moment by stillness. I started the engine. The hum of the car, tires on gravel, felt loud at first. Then I merged onto the road. I carried the forest with me. Tremor in my chest, lungs tuned to fresh air, memory of standing alone in darkness while watching the embers glow. I drove until the trees fell away behind me, but I knew I would carry their weight into the city. I breathed deep and smiled, knowing the woods would be waiting, watchful, ancient, and I would return. I lay awake in my sleeping bag, the night air cool against my face. My breath rose in small clouds, and I could hear the gentle rustle of pines overhead. The campfire a few feet away had died to glowing embers, and the stars above shone bright in the clear, open sky. I felt the weight of the forest pressing in around me, dense trunks and thick brush forming dark shapes just beyond the firelight. My heart thumped low and steady. I'd come here alone to get away from noise and people. The trailhead at dusk had been quiet. I carried what I needed: a small tent, food for 3 days, water, first aid supplies, and enough courage to face the wilderness alone. I set camp near a flat clearing, cleared most rocks, pitched my tent, then built the fire. I cooked dehydrated chili over the flames, the smell comforting, warm. Afterward, I washed dishes in a nearby creek, feeling the cold water rush over my fingers. As night fell, the quiet deepened. Frogs croaked, crickets chirped, owls hooted far off. I felt small, but oddly peaceful. I slipped into my sleeping bag around 10:30, the embers still warm. I listened, waiting for sleep to come. I woke around midnight to a distant crack, a snap of something heavy stepping on a branch. I froze, my ears strained, nothing else. I stayed still and imagined a deer passing, or a raccoon rooting, but I felt something shifting just outside the tent. I swallowed hard. I didn't move. A breeze stirred the tent fabric. Maybe it was just that. I breathed out slowly. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. When morning came, sun filtered through the pines. I packed a little wood into the fire before leaving. My plan for the day was to follow a ridge trail to a nearby overlook. I ate energy bars and sipped water, then shouldered my pack and headed off. The trail wound up gentle slopes through the trees. Moss-covered rocks and ferns grew thick. I spotted woodpecker marks and heard chickadees overhead. A light breeze stirred the branches and I felt at ease. I paused to rest at a fallen log. I think this is what I needed, I told myself. A break from everything. Halfway to the overlook, I heard another crack behind me. I stopped, turned slowly. There was no one. The woods looked empty. A chill passed over me. I whispered a prayer. I had a knife in my pocket. I kept walking faster now until I reached the top. The view was worth it. Miles of forested hills, half hidden in morning haze. I felt small and alive all at once. I took pictures, filled my water bottle at a tiny seep of clear spring water, and ate a sandwich. I lingered, then returned down the trail. I wanted to be back at camp before dusk. Past the log, past the creek, under the same pines. I made good time, feeling strong and confident. Back at camp in early afternoon, I found the creek did not run as high as I left it. I rinsed my clothes and hung them to dry on a low branch. I gathered firewood, organized gear, and started cooking dinner later than planned. When the meal was done, I left the dishes by the creek and prepared for night. I sat beside the fire, reading a page or two from a worn paperback. I liked the crackle of flames and the smell of smoke mixed with pine. My flashlight lay beside me. My pocket knife glinted on my belt. At 9 p.m., I extinguished the fire, let embers die inside the pit, covered with ashes, and got into my tent. I set up an extra layer of tarp above, in case it rained. I stepped back and surveyed my safe little shelter. Inside the tent, I lay on my side with my headlamp off. I stared at the mesh overhead, the sky tiny through a few openings between branches. The wood smelled damp, earthy. Around 11, just as I was drifting toward sleep, I heard it. A low tearing sound, as if bark peeled from a tree. I froze, heart pounding. The sound repeated, slow, deliberate. Tear, pause, tear. I whispered from inside, "It's just wind." But the wind had died hours ago. I held my breath. The sound went on. Tear, pause, tear. Closer now. It echoed across the clearing, maybe only 30 feet away. Fresh bark floated down to the tent. I crawled out slowly, hands gripping the tent sides, unzipping quietly. A white flash of nervous breath. It was pitch black outside except for the faint glow of stars. I scanned with my headlamp, light shaking on untidy wood. The sound had stopped. I stepped out. Tent flap closed behind me quietly. I shined the light around. My fire pit was cold. Everything looked normal, but the torn bark lay on the ground near the fire ring. I bent to pick it up. The scratching was deliberate and low. I raised my head, scanning the trees. Odd shapes. Nothing moved. I took another piece of bark in hand. Long strip, torn from a tree about 4 inches in diameter. Whoever or whatever had done it was strong. I shivered, looked around again. Then a snap of a twig somewhere behind me to the north. I whipped around. Light caught a tall figure stepping between trees, maybe 50 feet away. Just a shape, blurred. I blinked. It was gone. My pulse raced. I felt suddenly dread cold. I called softly, "Hello?" But voice shook. No answer. I clenched the strip of bark and backed slowly toward my tent. Inside, I closed zippers. I kept the headlamp on low beam. I uncurled and sat upright, knife in hand, bark strip on my lap like a trophy of fear. I tried to tell myself it was an animal. Bear clawing bark off to mark territory, perhaps a curious moose. But bears usually leave claw marks higher, and bark strips like this come from bears chewing. It's possible. I tried to calm down, listening. The forest was silent again. Wind, still occasional breeze. Eventually my eyelids got heavy. I laid flat in the sleeping bag, knife within hand's reach. I didn't sleep, more like dozed, drifting while awake, conscious of every sound. At 2 a.m., I woke abruptly. The tent walls swayed like someone shoved against them. Leaves brushed my face. The noise, low breathing like panting. Lightning? No, a living breath. My headlamp flashed on accidentally. Through the tent mesh, I saw 2 glowing yellow dots, high on a tree trunk at about my level. My face felt ice cold. I stared, too scared to breathe. The dots stayed. The panting noise grew. I unzipped partially, the cold air slammed in. I held the knife in front. The eyes blinked off and were replaced by shapes. Maybe a big cat? A mountain lion? Distance measured? They were far but close enough. They crouched. I felt the ground tremble. My heart hammered. The athlete in me, the part used to running scared, kicked in. I had no bear spray. I couldn't shout. Might provoke. I inch-backed away. The breathing stopped. No more eye glow. The forest fell silent and empty again. My muscles wound tight with terror. I got out of the tent, gear at feet. I grabbed a couple of rocks and held the knife. I searched the shape's direction with the headlamp, sweeping across trees. Nothing. I swung branches low. I made noise. My plan, hike out at first light. Not stay another night. That clear peace came like a wave. Safety mattered more than solitude. I sat by the cold fire pit, built a small flame from spare wood. Firelight made me feel less vulnerable. I stared into it until dawn, when gray light came through the trees. I heard a fox scream in the distance. I snorted with relief, wildlife, not something bigger. I packed quickly. Tent down, bag rolled, backpack strapped. I left the tarp. Ashes scattered. My hand swoeg as a drankwater. Day broke fully at 6:15 a.m. I started down the trail, faster than before. Each crack behind me made me whirl, but nothing followed. No eyes, no breath, no silhouettes. I reached the ridge overlook again, midday sun shining. It looked peaceful, irrelevant. I drank water, paused, thought of turning around and heading home. This was enough forest for me. Back at the car before 2 p.m., I locked the doors inside, feeling relief in my bones. I hit the ignition. Radio crackled to life. Later, at home, I washed and dressed. I taped the bark strip in a book. The bark remains a reminder. At night, when I lie in bed, I close my eyes and remember the yellow eyes in the dark, the ragged bark, the breathing outside my tent. I feel the same chill, but with it a quiet pride. I went in alone, faced fear more real than any ghost or story, and came back safe. I learned that night how quick peace can shift to fear, how close you come to something wild and true. But the ending is clear. I walked out under sun, drove home on paved road, and on both mornings after, I woke alive and free. I trusted myself to survive. Back when I was about 14 or 15, my family used to go camping every summer at a state park about 2 hours from where we lived. It wasn't the fanciest place. Mostly pine trees, gravel roads, picnic tables with uneven benches, and public bathrooms that smelled like bleach and mildew no matter the time of day. But I loved it. I still think about that park sometimes. The way the wind moved through the trees, how the sun looked dripping through the tall branches in the late afternoon, even the slow evenings where the sky turned purple behind the ridge. I felt comfortable there in a way I didn't feel anywhere else. My best friend at the time, I'll call him Mike, used to come along with us almost every year. We'd been friends since elementary school, and by the time we were teenagers, we were basically inseparable. If I was going, he was going. He'd always bring a duffel bag that looked like it had been packed by a drunk raccoon, half-open cereal boxes, mismatched socks, a pocket knife, a bunch of batteries, and a flashlight that was always out of juice within the first 2 hours of getting there. But he was good company, always up for exploring, and had the kind of humor that made being bored almost impossible. One thing we did every single night without fail was what we called the ritual. Sounds stupid now, but back then it meant something to us. After the sun went down, usually an hour or so after dinner when our parents were settling into their fold-out chairs and cracking open cheap beers, Mike and I would grab our flashlights and sneak off into the woods. We didn't have a plan or a destination. That was kind of the point. We just picked a direction and walked until we got tired or freaked ourselves out. Then we'd double back before our parents even noticed we were gone. There was something about walking around in the dark like that, on purpose, that gave us a weird kind of thrill. The woods always looked different at night. Trees seemed taller. Sounds carried further. The crunch of leaves under your feet sounded like it echoed all the way to the tops of the trees. And the wind didn't sound the same either. It whistled sometimes, almost like someone exhaling slowly. I knew those woods pretty well during the day, but at night, they might as well have been a whole different place. We always brought flashlights, but we liked to challenge ourselves by keeping them off for as long as possible. Our eyes would adjust pretty quick, especially when there was a decent moon. If it was too cloudy, we'd give ourselves a little slack and flick the lights on for a minute or two just to get our bearings. But most nights, it was just the two of us moving through the trees like shadows. On this one particular night, one I've never been able to forget, we decided to push the ritual a little further. We were in the mood for something more intense, something that would stick with us. I don't know what got into us. Maybe we were just trying to feel grown up, like we were testing ourselves. Maybe we were just bored. Either way, instead of stopping at our usual turnaround spot near a dry creek bed, we kept going. Deeper into the woods, past where the noise from the campground faded and the lights from the bathrooms and cabins disappeared behind the trees. I remember looking back at one point and realizing I couldn't see a single other person. Not even the dull yellow glow from the lanterns back at the campgrounds. Just trees and darkness. We were probably about half a mile from the nearest campsite at that point. Far enough that if we yelled, no one would hear us. I wasn't scared, not really, but I felt this growing tightness in my chest that hadn't been there before. That quiet, slow kind of anxiety that builds in the back of your mind when something feels off and your brain hasn't figured out why yet. We were walking single file along a narrow trail that barely existed. It might have been made by deer, or maybe just the path of least resistance through the undergrowth. Branches kept catching our arms and jeans. I kept having to duck under low limbs. Mike was ahead of me, trying to be quiet but still crunching every other leaf like it was made of glass. I was just about to tell him to slow down when I heard it, the softest, faintest whisper coming from behind us. It was so quiet that at first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. You know how when you're alone and thinking hard, you almost think you hear your name being called? It was like that, but then I heard it again. Not a name, not a sentence, just sound. Whispering. Close. Too close. I froze. My skin prickled instantly, like every hair on my arms was standing straight up. My stomach dropped. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even fast. It was just there. Constant. Soft. Mike must have heard it too because he stopped walking. I turned on my flashlight without even thinking and swung it around behind us. The beam cut through the dark, lighting up trees and bushes and patches of ground. Nothing. Just leaves, bark, and shadows. We both stood still for maybe 30 seconds, listening. No wind, no insects, no sound at all except the crunch of our breathing. After a minute, Mike turned back and started walking again. Slower this time. I kept the flashlight on, sweeping it side to side just in case. Maybe it had been an animal. Possum, a raccoon. Something moving through the leaves in just the right way to sound human. That's what I told myself, over and over. Just an animal, just an animal. But then we heard it again. This time it was louder, still a whisper, but clearer. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely human, definitely speech. Soft and low like someone muttering under their breath. Mike spun around and pointed his light too. We both scanned the trees like crazy. Nothing, not a single movement. No eyes reflecting in the beam. Just the forest, silent and still. I was done. I told Mike we should head back. He didn't argue. We turned around and started walking fast. Not running, just fast enough to get the hell out of there, but not so fast that we trip over roots or twist an ankle. I kept checking over my shoulder every few seconds. I didn't want to be the guy in a horror movie that never looks behind him. Then we saw her. At first I thought it was a tree stump or a fallen log. Something out of place but explainable. But it moved. Crawling. Person. A woman. Low to the ground. Elbows and knees in the dirt. Dragging herself slowly through the underbrush like she was trying to be invisible. My heart just stopped. For a full second I couldn't breathe. I didn't even register fear. Just this white-hot shock that froze every part of me. She was wearing dark clothes, maybe black or deep navy, and her whole body was streaked with dirt. Her hair hung around her face in tangled clumps. Her mouth was moving, whispering something non-stop, just a stream of random, disconnected words. We stood there with our flashlights locked on her. She didn't look up at first, just kept crawling, mumbling. Then, all at once, she noticed us noticing her. She stopped crawling, looked straight at us through the beams of light, and stood up. She was probably in her 20s, maybe early 30s. Her eyes looked too wide, like she hadn't slept in days. Her voice came out louder this time, more clear. She said she was looking for her campsite. That's it, just that. She was looking for her group. For a long second, we just stood there staring at each other. My first instinct was to bolt, to turn and run and not look back. But something about the way she stood there, swaying a little, her arms limp at her sides, made me think she wasn't dangerous. Just gone, lost in her own head, high, drunk, or both. We didn't ask questions, didn't tell her how creepy it was to find her crawling through the woods like that. We just said we'd walk her back. We took slow steps, constantly glancing over to make sure she wasn't doing anything weird. She kept mumbling to herself under her breath, but at least she was walking upright now. The hike back felt 3 times as long. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt like a new threat. She walked between us, slow and clumsy, like her legs didn't know how to move right. Twice she tripped over nothing. Once she walked straight into a tree trunk like she didn't even see it. Mike had to guide her with a hand on her elbow after that. Eventually, we made it back to the edge of the campground. The lights from the bathrooms were visible now. I've never been so glad to see those ugly yellow bulbs in my life. We brought her over to the parking lot and sat her down on a picnic bench while we tried to figure out what to do. She kept saying she needed to find her friends, but couldn't remember where their tent was. She didn't know her site number. She didn't even seem sure what her name was. We walked up and down the rows of tents and trailers with her, looking for someone who might recognize her. After about 20 minutes of walking, a group of young adults sitting around a campfire looked up and one of them yelled her name. She stumbled over to them like nothing had happened. One of the guys asked where she'd gone and she just mumbled something about the bathroom. They all laughed like it was nothing, like she hadn't just been lost in the woods, crawling around in the dark like a feral animal. No one seemed concerned. No one even stood up. Mike and I didn't say anything. We just looked at each other, shrugged, and walked back to our tent. We didn't talk about it much that night. We didn't go on our usual ritual walk the next night either. I think we were both just processing it in our own ways. I kept thinking about how easily she could have died out there. If we hadn't gone that far, if we turned around sooner, if our flashlights had been off for just a Every summer, my church group would go camping together for 2 weeks. It wasn't some spiritual retreat or anything. We weren't constantly praying or doing church activities. It was just a chance for us to be together in the woods, to bond over hikes, games, and the peace that came from being away from everything. We were a group of people who, despite not having much in common, somehow found connection through these trips. And it had become a tradition. I was 16 at the time, the oldest in our group. I was used to being the one who looked out for others, though I didn't always like it. I guess that's just what happens when you're the oldest. It becomes your role whether you want it or not. The younger kids looked up to me, and the counselors often relied on me to keep an eye on the others. I didn't mind. I'd been going on these trips since I was a kid, and I was familiar with every rock, every tree, and every trail in the area. 1 week into our trip, the counselors decided to play a game. They set up stations throughout the woods, each with its own mini-challenge. The idea was to walk through the forest, stopping at each station to complete a task. Some of the tasks were simple, like throwing a ball into a target or balancing on a log, while others were more difficult, like climbing over obstacles or carrying heavy items. My group was up first. We started off easy enough, crossing a small creek. It wasn't deep, maybe just knee-high, but it was slippery and had a strong current after the rain the night before. We had to hop across the rocks, making sure we didn't lose our balance and fall into the water. I was in the back, so I watched as the others made it across. I carefully took my time, balancing myself, making sure my feet found solid ground. Once across, we continued our trek, climbing a steep hillside. It was hard work, but nothing I couldn't handle. The hill was long and covered with loose dirt and small rocks that crunched underfoot. I had to pause a couple of times to catch my breath, but eventually, we made it to the top. The next challenge was to carry a tree trunk from one point to another. It wasn't a large trunk, but it was heavy. There were 6 of us, so we took turns carrying it back and forth, trying to see how many times we could do it before we got too tired. It was exhausting. The sun was high, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my back. My muscles were sore, and the air felt thick and heavy. Despite the heat, I pushed through. I didn't want to be the one to complain, the one to slow down the group. Then something happened. As I lifted the trunk for what felt like the 100th time, I twisted my ankle. I didn't even see it coming. 1 second I was steady, the next I was on the ground, clutching my ankle in pain. My first instinct was to try and get up, but I couldn't. A sharp pain shot up my leg, and I immediately realized that something was wrong. I stayed there for a second, hoping that the pain would subside, but it didn't. I tried to put weight on my foot, but I couldn't. I looked up at the group, but they hadn't noticed. They were all focused on the trunk, busy with the task at hand. They were ahead of me, and I was still on the ground, unable to move. I could hear the laughter and voices in the distance, but it felt like I was in my own little world, isolated by the pain. I tried to stand up again, this time more carefully, but the moment my foot hit the ground, the pain surged through me and I collapsed back down. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself not to cry. I was the oldest, I had to be tough. Crying would only make it worse. I couldn't be the one to show weakness. So, I limped to the group, taking it slow, trying not to let them see how much pain I was in. When I finally caught up to them, I collapsed onto the ground and looked at my ankle. It was swollen and it was getting worse by the second. I tried to move it, but the pain was unbearable. My counselor, who was about 17 at the time, walked over. She looked at me with concern, but she didn't say much. She was a little overstrained herself, trying to manage everything and everyone. She didn't know what to do, so she called Mark, our camp leader, to come and look at it. We sat there for what felt like forever, waiting. The rest of the group was still finishing their task, unaware of what was happening with me. I stared at the ground, trying to stay calm, trying not to panic, but my mind was racing. I had to get back to camp, I had to be okay. What if this meant I had to leave? What if my parents found out and I had to go home? I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to disappoint anyone. When Mark finally showed up with another counselor, they both looked at my ankle and decided that they needed to get me down the hill. The other route would have been 2 kilometers long, but the one we took was much shorter, only 5 minutes away by foot. The problem was that I couldn't walk. I was in too much pain to even stand, so they decided to carry me. I don't remember much of the walk down. I think I was in shock. My mind was fuzzy, my body exhausted. I had my eyes closed most of the time, trying to block out everything around me, but the ride was anything but smooth. The path was rocky and uneven, and every bump seemed to send a shock of pain through my body. I could feel the cool breeze against my skin, and I heard the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling, but it all felt so distant. I couldn't concentrate on anything except the throbbing in my ankle. At one point, we came across another group and we stopped to rest. My friend was with that group, and later, she told me that I wasn't responsive at all. I didn't react to anything they said. I just stared straight ahead, blankly. Felt like I was in a dream. Nothing seemed real. The next part of the journey was when I started to panic. We had to cross the creek again, and I knew that wasn't going to happen. The water was moving faster now, and the rocks were slippery. My 2 counselors were exhausted from carrying me, so they switched out with 2 others. I was scared, I'll admit it. I didn't want to fall into that water. I didn't want to make things worse for myself or for anyone else. I just wanted to get to the car, get to the hospital, and know that everything would be okay. Eventually, they managed to get me into the car, and we drove to the nearest hospital. I don't remember much of the drive. I was so focused on the pain in my leg that I didn't really pay attention to anything outside the window. The city was much bigger than the camp area, and it was so different. The noise, the people, the lights. It all felt so overwhelming after the quiet of the woods. At the hospital, they did the usual tests. X-rays, checking my pulse, asking me questions I didn't really want to answer. I just wanted them to fix my ankle. The doctor looked at the results and casually told me that I had torn my cruciate ligament. It was bad, he said. I needed to give myself injections in my belly every day to manage the pain and prevent further complications. I was shocked. I thought it was just a sprain, but it was so much worse. My mind raced. I was going to be stuck on crutches for the rest of the trip, and I felt a heavy sense of guilt. I should have been tougher. I should have been stronger, but there was nothing I could do now. When I returned to camp, I was given crutches to help me get around. It was a strange feeling, being the one who needed help for once. I wasn't used to being dependent on others. The counselors had to carry me sometimes, or help me move from place to place. It was a weird experience. I'd known these guys since I was 11, but being carried like that felt so foreign, so vulnerable. I didn't like it, but I stayed. I stayed for the rest of the week, despite everything. It wasn't easy, but I was determined to finish what I had started. My parents never fully realized how bad my injury was. They thought I was just being dramatic, but it was real. It was terrifying. By the end of the week, I had learned something that I still carry with me to this day. Life is unpredictable. You can be strong one moment and helpless the next. You can't control everything, no matter how much you want to. I learned to accept help when I needed it, to rely on others when I couldn't do it alone. And that's a lesson I'll never forget. I took a week off work to get away from everything. The plan was simple: spend 5 days solo camping through a stretch of forest in northern Idaho. I'd been there once before on a short overnight trip with some buddies, and I remembered the terrain being pretty forgiving, with quiet trails, tall pine trees, and the kind of open silence that felt like stepping away from the noise of the world. This time, I wanted to test myself a little. Go off trail. Try a new loop I'd marked out on a map with some handwritten notes and a compass instead of depending on apps. I brought a Garmin just in case of emergency, but I didn't plan on using it unless something went wrong. And I didn't expect anything to go wrong. The first day was smooth. I parked at a small trailhead lot around 9 a.m., the kind that only fits a couple cars, and mine was the only one there. I shouldered my pack and set off. The air was cool, thin with that high elevation bite, and the smell of dry pine needles mixed with dirt. I followed a wide, established trail for about 4 miles before breaking off onto a much fainter one that wasn't maintained. It was more like a memory of a path than an actual trail. After another few miles, I found a flat spot beside a creek and set up my tent. I boiled water for dinner, read a bit by headlamp, and crawled into my sleeping bag early. The wind rustled the trees. I didn't hear another human sound the whole night. The second day, I pushed deeper into the woods. I crossed a shallow stream by walking over a fallen log slick with moss, climbed a ridge that gave me a sweeping view of endless forest stretching to the horizon. Felt like I had the world to myself. I found some deer tracks in the mud, and a little later, a pile of bear scat, dry and old, not fresh. It didn't bother me. I'd spent enough time in the backcountry to know what to look out for. I kept my food in a bear bag and always hung it far from my tent. By late afternoon, I made it to a small clearing tucked into a grove of firs. It was a quiet, peaceful place. I hadn't seen any sign of other hikers, and I liked that. I boiled water, ate some dehydrated pasta, cleaned up, and sat with my back against a tree until the sun dipped below the tree-line. The sky went deep purple, then black. I zipped into my tent and drifted off to sleep to the hum of crickets and the occasional snap of a branch. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound that didn't fit. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps, crunching softly in the underbrush just beyond the tent. I froze. My heart started hammering. I lay still, listening. It wasn't a deer. Deer move quickly and don't sound like that. These were slow, careful steps, like someone trying not to be heard. I stayed perfectly still. The steps stopped. I couldn't hear anything but my own breathing and the thump of my heartbeat in my ears. After a while, I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag and reached for the knife I kept near the tent flap. I didn't move beyond that, just waited. I must have laid there for an hour before I finally drifted off again from pure exhaustion. In the morning, everything looked normal. I stepped outside and checked the area. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing obviously disturbed. Maybe it had just been an animal and I was too wired to tell the difference. I tried to shake it off. I packed up and kept moving. By the third day, I was at the furthest point from the trailhead. The forest was denser here, darker even during the day. The trees stood closer together, and sunlight only reached the forest floor in thin beams. I followed a narrow trail between two ridges, moving slow and deliberate. I paused around noon to eat and refill my water from a nearby stream. That's when I noticed it. A broken branch, freshly snapped, right beside the stream, pointing at an odd angle like someone had brushed past it hard. I scanned the woods but didn't see anything. Then I spotted something else. A scuff mark on the trail, like a boot heel that slipped slightly in the dirt. Not mine. I had been careful. It looked newer than anything else around it. My stomach dropped a little. I wasn't supposed to be this far off the grid with anyone else. The trail I was on wasn't even marked on most maps. I moved on faster than before, trying not to make it obvious I was hurrying. The idea of someone else out here wasn't scary by itself. People hike all the time, but the footsteps in the night, the broken branch, the scuff in the dirt, they weren't sitting right with me. That night, I camped near a small rock outcropping where the trees opened up slightly. I had a clear view in 3 directions and only one side to watch closely. I didn't light a fire. I kept dinner cold and simple jerky and trail mix. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside the tent but didn't sleep much. Every sound seemed louder. At some point, just after midnight, I thought I heard a twig snap nearby. I sat up, knife in hand, staring at the tent flap. I waited. Nothing else came. I must have stayed up until the sky started turning light gray. In the morning, my hands were shaking as I packed. I didn't feel rested. I didn't feel like I was out here for peace anymore. Something was wrong. I decided to change my route and cut my trip a day short. I could make it back to the trailhead in 2 long days if I kept a steady pace. I turned west, planning to rejoin the main trail a few miles ahead. I walked hard all day, barely stopped to eat. I kept checking behind me, trying not to be obvious about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was back there, always just out of sight. In the late afternoon, I heard a sharp, quick whistle, 3 short notes, from somewhere in the trees behind me. I froze. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't an animal. It was human, a signal. But who the hell was it meant for? I took off, full speed. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I bushwhacked through undergrowth, thorns tearing at my sleeves. I scrambled up a steep hillside, grabbing roots and branches for balance. At the top, I looked back, but I didn't see anyone. Still, I didn't stop. I didn't pitch a tent that night. I hiked until it was too dark to see, then rolled myself in the sleeping bag behind a fallen tree and tried to stay hidden. Every rustle of wind through the leaves made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep. I just waited for the sun to come up. On the final day, I reconnected with the main trail. Relief flooded me when I saw it. Wide, flat, familiar. I followed it for miles, watching the sun rise higher. I didn't relax. I didn't let my guard down. Around noon, I rounded a bend and saw something that made my heart drop. A small pile of rocks stacked neatly beside the trail. It hadn't been there the first day. I would have noticed. It was deliberate, a marker, or a message. I didn't stop to examine it. I kept going, faster, my boots pounding the dirt. Another 2 hours later, I finally saw the trailhead parking lot through the trees. My car was still there, untouched. No other vehicles. I made it to the driver's side and threw my pack into the back seat, hands trembling as I unlocked the door. As I turned the key, I caught one final thing in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the trees, far back where the trail disappeared into the forest, there was movement. Someone standing just beyond the tree line. I couldn't see their face. They didn't come forward. They just stood there, watching. I didn't wait. I backed out, tires spitting gravel, and drove until I hit pavement, then kept driving until I reached the first gas station 30 miles away. I didn't stop for anything. That was 2 years ago. I haven't gone solo backpacking since. I still hike, but I stick to busy trails now, places where other people are always nearby. I installed a dash cam. I carry bear spray everywhere. I check behind me more often than I used to, and I still don't know who was out there with me, what they wanted, why they followed me, why they waited until I was so far from help. But I know one thing for sure: I wasn't alone out there. And whatever their reason for being there was, it wasn't good. I was lucky to get out when I did. I don't think I ever want to be that far from other people again. Not after that. Camping was something my family did every summer when I was growing up. It wasn't a question of if we were going, just a matter of where. We'd load up the car with tents, tarps, coolers, food bins, sleeping bags, and whatever else my parents decided we needed that year. Sometimes it was Virginia Beach, sometimes Westmoreland, which I always dreaded. It had these swampy parts, bugs the size of your thumb, and it just smelled like hot plastic and mildew all the time. But then there was Assateague, which was a different kind of wild. You had the beach, the breeze, the salty air, and the ponies. Real, actual wild ponies. That summer, I think I was maybe around 9 or 10. Old enough to understand what was going on, but still young enough that things could easily scare me if they caught me off guard. We got to the campground in Assateague sometime in the afternoon. The sun was still high, the wind kicking up little bursts of sand in the parking lot. You could smell the sea even before you could see it. And I remember feeling excited when we parked the car and started unpacking. It was hot, humid, but the kind of heat that comes with a breeze that almost makes it feel like a reward. You sweat, but then the wind hits you and you think, yeah, this isn't too bad. We picked a campsite that was closer to the beach than usual. My parents liked hearing the waves at night, and I liked that you didn't have to walk as far to get to the water. There was a little dune just past our site, and from the top, you could see the ocean stretching out, endless and gray-blue, with sunlight flashing off the surface like broken glass. We brought 2 tents that year, a larger dome tent for my parents and me, and a smaller one for extra storage or changing clothes, or sometimes my older cousin if he came with us. But that trip, it was just the 3 of us. We set up the main tent closer to the trees and the smaller one maybe 30 or 40 feet away, near where the sandy path dipped toward the beach. The day was pretty uneventful. We grilled hot dogs, ate chips, and got sand in everything. I ran up and down the beach, chased a few crabs, and tried to skim stones into the waves even though the surf always swallowed them before I could tell if I was doing it right. The sun eventually dropped behind the dunes and turned everything golden for about 10 minutes before the sky started going purple and then dark. Campfires flickered around the other sites, and the air filled with the sound of wood crackling, people laughing, bugs buzzing. At night, the beach gets quiet. There's this stillness to it that's only broken by the wind and the waves. You don't get city noise out there. No cars, no phones, just nature doing its thing. That night, I remember the fire dying down slowly. My dad poked at the coals with a stick while my mom packed away what food was left. Then we turned in. I fell asleep to the sound of waves and the faint rustling of the wind tugging at the tent's rainfly. The fabric swayed gently in and out, like the whole thing was breathing. It felt safe, like being wrapped in a soft, warm bag. I always liked sleeping in the tent, even when it got cold, because it felt like a little house just for us. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark, the kind of deep, middle-of-the-night dark that feels heavier than just the absence of light. The moon must have been out, though, because I could see shapes and shadows inside the tent. At first, I wasn't sure what woke me. Everything was still. I didn't hear anything obvious. No crack of branches, no footsteps, nothing that would normally pull someone out of sleep. But I was awake, and I felt that creeping sense that something was just a little bit off. It took me a second to realize my mom was sitting up. Her sleeping bag was pulled back, and she was completely still, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. She wasn't shaking me or talking, just sitting there staring. That's when I noticed her head was turned toward the mesh window of the tent. I followed her gaze and saw it too. There was a figure outside, right up against the tent wall, just on the other side of the mesh, maybe a foot away from where we were sleeping. It looked like a woman, an old woman, thin, with long hair that moved slightly in the breeze, almost like it was floating. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline in the moonlight. Her posture was bent slightly forward, like she was leaning in to see inside. I froze. My heart jumped into my throat and just sat there, thudding hard. I felt cold even though it was warm in the tent. I didn't know what I was looking at, but everything about it felt wrong. Like I'd woken up in a dream that was already halfway to being a nightmare. My mom didn't move, didn't say anything, just stared. I remember whispering to her, not loud, just enough to make a sound. But that was enough. The figure flinched, then moved, fast. Not like a person, not really. It was lower to the ground than I expected, and the way it moved, there was no sound of footsteps. Just this rustling, like brush being pushed aside. Then the shape was gone. My mom finally turned and looked at me. I don't remember if she said anything. I just remember both of us staring at the mesh, then out into the night. My heart was still hammering in my chest, and I didn't want to go back to sleep. Every shadow seemed sharper now, every noise louder. I heard a soft thud somewhere outside, like hooves on packed sand, and for a second, I didn't understand what I just heard. Then it clicked. My mom opened the tent and stepped out with a flashlight, and I followed, more out of fear of being left alone than anything else. The beam of light cut across the sand and trees, and that's when we saw them. Ponies. Wild, feral ponies, just casually making their way down the narrow path toward the beach. There were 4 of them. One had a coat so light it looked white in the moonlight, its mane long and tangled. That was what I'd seen, what we both saw. The old woman was a pony, standing close to the tent, probably trying to sniff around for food. Its long mane hanging down had looked like wiry hair. Its posture, hunched and strange in the shadows, had looked human only because my brain had filled in the blanks wrong in the dark. The campsite had been set up right across one of their trails. We didn't know it, or maybe we hadn't paid enough attention when we were setting up the tents, but that's what it was. The ponies were just following their regular path down toward the water. They weren't trying to scare anyone. They probably didn't even know we were there until they got too close. Eventually, we went back into the tent. My mom zipped it up, checked the snacks were packed away in the bins outside, and lay back down. I stayed awake longer, just listening to the ponies walking past, their soft hooves padding in the sand, the occasional snort or shake of their manes. I could still picture the shape in the window, the silhouette that had looked so much like something else. It was a long time before I fell asleep again, and even then, I kept waking up to the slightest sounds. But by morning, everything looked normal again. Just another bright, hot day on the island. The ponies were gone, probably grazing in the brush somewhere farther down. Our tent had faint hoof prints near it, soft dents in the sand like they had stopped and lingered for a while before moving on. We ate breakfast, packed up a few things, and went down to the beach. The water was cold that morning, colder than I remembered it being the day before. I didn't say anything about what happened that night, and neither did my mom, but I kept looking over at the trail, watching for movement in the brush. That night stuck with me, though, not because anything bad actually happened, but because of how real the fear had felt, even when the truth turned out to be something ordinary. It taught me how the mind fills in gaps when it doesn't have all the information. In the dark, a pony becomes a person. A shadow becomes a threat. Your own imagination can trip you up worse than anything else out there. And after that trip, we always checked where the trails were before pitching our tents. It was one of those midweek nights a few years ago when the campground was quiet, really quiet. The kind of quiet that feels different from the noise of the city or the chatter of a busy park on a weekend. Most people were tucked away in their trailers or tents early, probably tired from the day's hiking or swimming. The air was cool, almost crisp for summer, with a faint scent of pine and damp earth lingering beneath the tall trees that surrounded the corner campsite where we were parked. Our site was tucked at the edge of the park, a kind of corner spot that backed directly onto a small wooded area. It wasn't a big forest, more like a thicket of trees and bushes, but enough to feel enclosed and a bit shadowy once the sun went down. The back of the campsite had a narrow trail that cut through the woods. Just a simple dirt path, maybe 15 or 20 feet long, barely wide enough for one person at a time. It connected us directly to the campground's comfort stations. Those bathrooms were one of the few lights on the whole site, glowing faintly in the dark, giving off an orange-yellow glow through the screen door of the small wooden building. The campground rules technically said you could go around the front road to get to the bathrooms, but that meant walking almost twice as far. I was tired, and besides, I'd cut through the woods plenty of times before. It was always quicker that way. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. It wasn't urgent, but I knew if I waited any longer, I'd be uncomfortable the rest of the night. The trailer was dark and silent except for the faint hum of the small refrigerator running in the corner and the soft rustling of leaves outside. I got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake anyone else, and grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table. I clicked it on, the beam bright and sharp cutting through the darkness of the trailer as I stepped outside. The night air was cool and smelled like wet grass and old leaves. Crickets were chirping softly somewhere, but otherwise, everything was still. The campground felt almost abandoned. I zipped my jacket a little tighter and started toward the back of the site where the trail started. The flashlight beam danced over the trunks of trees, the trail itself littered with small twigs and fallen leaves that crunched softly under my shoes. I walked briskly, my breath visible in the chilly night air. The woods around the trail were dark and dense, but I could still make out shapes. The crooked branches, a pile of rocks near a tree stump, a patch of ferns moving slightly in the breeze. I felt calm at first, the kind of calm that comes from being somewhere familiar, a place you know well and trust. The flashlight's beam caught a few glints of moisture on the leaves, reflecting little points of light like tiny stars. Halfway through the trail, something happened that changed the whole mood. I heard it before I saw anything. A faint sound, like a giggle, right beside my ear. It was so soft, almost like a breath, but clear enough that I couldn't ignore it. My heart jumped, and my steps faltered for a split second. I spun my head around quickly, shining the flashlight into the woods on either side, trying to catch a glimpse of what might have made that noise. Maybe a raccoon or some other animal. I'd heard plenty of strange sounds in the woods before, from raccoons, porcupines, or even owls, but there was nothing. No rustling leaves, no moving shadows, no cracking twigs. Just silence except for the faint buzz of insects and the steady crunch of my own footsteps on the trail. No eyes caught in the flashlight's beam. No shape. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination or the wind playing tricks on me. I picked up my pace, scanning the shadows, hoping to spot a raccoon or some animal to explain the noise. I remember feeling a little nervous, but I tried not to let it get to me. Maybe it was just an animal making a strange sound. Then, just as that thought crossed my mind that maybe it was just an animal, I heard it. A voice. A woman's voice, clear and close, coming from deeper in the woods, just off the trail. The word was simple. Hello. I froze. The word hung in the cold air like a heavy fog. It wasn't a shout or a yell, more like a quiet question, but so sudden and unexpected that my heart jumped hard enough to feel like it would break out of my chest. My breath caught in my throat, and my whole body tensed like I was about to run for my life. And run I did. I took off down the trail at full speed, my flashlight bobbing wildly in my hand, casting erratic beams through the darkness. My foot caught on a hidden log just a few steps from the edge of the woods, and I went down hard, ripping the fabric of my pant leg on a sharp branch and scraping my shin badly against a rock beneath the leaves. The pain was sharp, but it didn't stop me. I scrambled back up, ignoring the sting, and bolted the rest of the way to the comfort station lights. By the time I reached the little building, I was breathing hard, heart pounding so loudly I thought maybe someone else could hear it. The bright, artificial lights felt like a shield, a safe space compared to the wild darkness I just escaped. I leaned against the doorframe for a moment, trying to catch my breath and steady my nerves. My shin throbbed painfully, the scrape already starting to sting as the blood began to soak through the torn pant leg. Inside, The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unwelcoming, but at least familiar. I locked the door behind me and took care of what I came for, hands shaking slightly as I washed them at the sink. I looked in the mirror above the sink and saw my pale, sweaty face staring back. I told myself, the biologist inside me that tries to explain everything logically, that it had to be a raccoon or a porcupine or some other animal making weird noises, and maybe my mind had filled in a voice where there was none. After all, the woods were full of sounds at night, some familiar, some strange, but none supernatural or sinister. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was overreacting. I wasn't a kid anymore, and I certainly didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. But the scrape on my leg and the pounding of my heart said otherwise. When I left the comfort station, I made a decision. I wasn't going to take the shortcut back through the woods. Instead, I headed back around the front, walking the longer, open road. The streetlights along the main campground road were dim and sparse, casting weak pools of light on the cracked pavement. But at least I could see everything clearly. I kept my flashlight on just in case, but mostly I walked with my eyes scanning the shadows, my senses on high alert. As I passed the entrance to the woods, the very trail I just fled, I gave it a wide berth. I didn't want to be anywhere near it, but just as I was about to cross the last stretch toward our campsite, I heard it again. Not a voice this time, more like a whisper carried on the wind, soft and low, barely audible but unmistakably clear. "Come back." The words sent a chill straight down my spine, freezing me in place for a moment. I don't know what I wanted more, to run or to find out where the voice was coming from. But I didn't stop. I turned and ran as fast as I could back toward the trailer, my breath ragged, legs aching from the earlier fall. I didn't look back until I was safely inside the trailer, the door locked behind me. The warm, stale air inside was a sharp contrast to the cold night outside. I sat down, my heart still racing, my leg throbbing, and thought about what had just happened. No logical explanation fit perfectly. No animal I'd ever heard made a female voice sound so clear and human. No other campers were supposed to be out that late. No one had passed through the woods in hours. I never took that shortcut through the woods at night again. The next season, my family got a new trailer with an indoor bathroom. I don't think I've been outside in the dark at a campground bathroom by myself since. Looking back, I don't know exactly what I heard or saw that night. Maybe it was just my imagination or the way the quiet made every little noise sound louder, stranger. But whatever it was, it made me respect the woods in a way I hadn't before. There's a difference between knowing something's out there and feeling it. And I don't plan to find out what that something really is anytime soon. It was the summer of the early 1980s when my mom, still a teenager back then, went camping for the very first time. She had never done anything like it before, never even really thought much about camping beyond the usual school trips or what she'd seen in movies. This trip was something different. It was with a small group of her closest friends, all about the same age, looking for an escape from their everyday lives. None of them knew much about camping, but they were excited to get away from home for a few days, away from the rules and restrictions that came with being underage. Their plan was simple: find the most isolated spot in the woods they could, set up camp, and drink without fear of anyone checking on them. The place they found was deep in the forest, far from any trails or roads. The trees there grew tall and thick, their branches forming a heavy canopy overhead that blocked most of the sunlight during the day. The forest floor was soft with moss and fallen leaves, and the smell of damp earth was everywhere. There was a small clearing where they set up their tents, just big enough for the group, with a fire ring already built from stones someone had arranged long ago. It was the perfect spot for them, quiet, hidden, and completely away from civilization. The first night, they drank and laughed, telling stories around the fire until their voices got hoarse and their heads spun a little. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the night sky. The stars above were bright and sharp, shining through the gaps in the trees. The woods felt alive, but not in a way that frightened them. At least not yet. Eventually, tired and tipsy, they decided to turn in for the night. The tents were set up close to each other, and they piled their sleeping bags inside. My mom lay down, the cold nylon fabric of the tent pressing against her skin. Outside, the fire slowly died down to glowing embers. The forest sounds continued. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig. She thought she was safe, but then she woke up. The noises were strange, different from the usual forest sounds. Something was out there, moving close by, just beyond the tent walls. Her heart started to pound, adrenaline rushing through her veins. She reached over and shook her friend, trying to wake her up, but the friend just mumbled that it was probably animals and to go back to sleep. But my mom couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She lay there in the dark, listening. The noises seemed to move around the camp, faint but clear, heavy footsteps on the ground, soft but deliberate. It was nothing she could see, nothing she could touch, but it made her skin crawl. The forest felt too quiet, except for those footsteps that circled the tents and the fire. Morning finally came, and with it came light and the courage to leave the tent and look around. What they found was unsettling. Around their tent and the fire pit were large boot prints pressed deep into the soft earth, arranged in a loose circle as if someone had paced back and forth, watching them. The prints were huge, much larger than any of their own boots, and the tread pattern was unfamiliar, rough, jagged, and worn in a way that suggested whoever made them had been coming through the forest for a long time. The footprints had come from the woods, making no attempt to hide their presence, and then left back in the same direction. The trees and thick bushes nearby made it impossible to follow the tracks further. The foliage was too dense, and the ground too soft in some places to leave clear prints beyond the clearing. The group was shaken. They weren't sure what had been circling their camp during the night, but the thought that someone or something had been watching them closely, so close they could hear the footsteps, was terrifying. They had come expecting a fun, secret weekend away. Instead, they were faced with the very real possibility that they weren't alone, and hadn't been at any point in the night. Despite plans to stay for a whole week, they packed up their things and left that very morning. No one said much on the trip back, but the mood was heavy, and the usual laughter and jokes were replaced with silence and unease. In the weeks and months that followed, my mom heard from other campers and locals that similar footprints had been found near campsites in the same area on several occasions. No one had been able to catch whoever was responsible, and no clear explanation had ever been given. The stories spread quietly, warning others to be careful in those woods, especially at night. My mom never went camping again, and when my siblings and I asked about it, she always refused. The memory of that night stayed with her. The feeling of being watched, the heavy silence between the trees, and the large footprints that marked the ground like a silent warning. The days leading up to the trip had been filled with excitement and nervous chatter. None of them really knew what to expect. My mom and her friends didn't have much camping gear, just a few sleeping bags, a small tent, some flashlights, and enough food and drinks to last the weekend. Their lack of experience showed in the way they set up camp. The tent was pitched quickly on uneven ground, close to a large tree, and the firewood was gathered hastily from the surrounding area. The air was humid and thick with the smell of pine and wet earth. Insects buzzed lazily in the fading light as they arrived, and the distant calls of birds echoed through the forest. The isolation of the place felt thrilling at first, a secret hidden from the world. As the night deepened, the fire became the center of their world. The flames danced wildly in the gentle breeze, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the group. They talked about everything and nothing, laughter ringing out beneath the dark canopy. The buzz of alcohol and youthful freedom made them feel invincible. But the woods had a way of reminding them that they were not alone. When my mom first heard the noises, it was subtle at first. A crunching of leaves, the soft snap of twigs breaking underfoot. She thought it might be raccoons or deer, creatures familiar and harmless. But as the minutes passed, the noises grew closer, heavier, more purposeful. The footsteps didn't sound like any animal. They were heavy and deliberate, the sound of boots pressing into the soil, not paws or claws. Her breath caught in her throat. The darkness outside the tent felt thicker, more suffocating. She wanted to call out, but the words wouldn't come. She shook her friend gently, hoping for reassurance, but was met with sleepy dismissal. That only made her more alert. Every small noise became amplified, the rustle of leaves, the distant crack of a branch breaking under weight. The footsteps moved slowly, circling around the camp, sometimes stopping as if whoever was out there was listening or watching. The tent walls felt paper-thin, offering no protection. She imagined eyes staring through the mesh, shadows shifting just beyond reach. Sleep became impossible. Morning arrived with a pale, gray light filtering through the trees. The forest seemed different in daylight, less threatening but no less real. The discovery of the boot prints confirmed her fears. They were unmistakable. Huge, deep impressions in the soft earth, worn in jagged soles unlike anything the group had seen before. They walked carefully around the clearing, tracing the prints where they could, but the dense underbrush swallowed them up quickly. The tracks led from the edge of the woods into the clearing and then disappeared back into the shadows of the trees. No footprints from other humans, no signs of a campsite nearby. Just these prints, like silent watchers who had paced their territory. The feeling of being watched didn't end with the footprints. Even after packing up and leaving, my mom said she could feel eyes following her, the forest closing in behind them as they drove away. She never forgot the helplessness of that night. The sense that something was out there, just beyond sight, waiting and watching. The story spread quietly among the locals and campers in the years after. Others found similar prints, sometimes near abandoned campsites or places where people had vanished overnight. The footprints were large and heavy, always the same rough tread. No one ever found any evidence of who or what left them, and the mystery remained unsolved. For my mom, the fear was real and lasting. She never allowed any of her children to go camping, no matter how much we begged or how safe the places seemed. The woods were no longer a place for fun and adventure. They were a place of shadows and silence, where footsteps might circle unseen. Even decades later, when the world had changed and camping became more popular and accessible, her warning stayed firm. Some things, she said, were better left alone. The woods were one of them. When I was a kid, summer meant packing up the caravan and heading out to whatever campground my parents had picked that year. We didn't go to the same place every summer. My dad liked variety, and my mom liked the peace of nature, as she always called it. Sometimes it was by a lake, sometimes up in the hills, and once we even camped next to a field full of cows, which my sister didn't like at all because she swore the cows stared at her. That year, though, the one I'll never forget, we set up at a campground near a forest, close to a wide-open field with a little stream at the edge. I must have been around 9 or 10, and my sister was maybe 2 years older. We had the same routine every time. Dad parked the caravan and got it all leveled, and then he'd hook up the electricity if there was any, while Mom unpacked food into the tiny fridge and set up the little awning area out front. My sister and I were usually off wandering the minute the car stopped, running around barefoot, getting scratched up on thistles, coming back sweaty and covered in dirt. It was the kind of freedom you don't even notice you're lucky to have until years later. That year, we had a new addition to our camping gear. My sister and I had begged my parents for weeks before the trip to let us sleep in our own tent. Not some big family-sized thing, just one of those small, two-person tents that pop up with a few poles and don't have room to stand in. We wanted independence. I don't know why we thought sleeping 3 feet away from the caravan was rebellious, but it felt like it. And my parents, after making us swear we'd come inside if it rained, finally agreed. We set the tent up directly in front of the caravan, maybe 6 or 7 feet from the door, close enough that we could still hear if our parents spoke, but far enough to feel like we were on our own. We each had inflatable mattresses, sleeping bags, a flashlight, and a pile of snacks we weren't supposed to eat all at once, but absolutely did. It was still bright outside when we crawled in the first night, full of excitement, giggling and poking each other, already sure we were going to stay in that tent every night of the trip. I remember how stuffy it got in there once we zipped the door closed, the kind of still heat that makes the air feel thick. Even though the sun was dropping, the tent held all the warmth like a greenhouse. The sides were thin, that synthetic fabric that feels like plastic against your skin, and every sound from outside came through clear. The rustling leaves, the breeze, the occasional buzz of a fly knocking into the mesh at the entrance. At first it was peaceful, familiar even. I think we fell asleep for a while. It must have been past midnight when we both woke up the first time. It wasn't the heat or a noise that woke me. I just remember opening my eyes and feeling suddenly cold, like the night air had soaked through the tent fabric and into my bones. My sister was already awake. I could see her silhouette in the dark, lying still, wide awake like me. Neither of us said anything. We just listened. There was a sound outside. It was quiet, soft, and for a moment I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, more clearly. A dragging sound, almost like fabric being pulled across grass, and something brushing lightly against the wall of the tent. Just a soft scrape like fingertips against nylon. Then it stopped. We didn't move. We just lay there, eyes wide, listening. Then it came again, this time on the other side of the tent. A gentle, shuffling drag along the wall, followed by another soft brush. Felt like someone was walking around us. My heart was pounding in my ears. I wanted to sit up, to shine the flashlight outside, to unzip the door and look, but I couldn't move. I could feel my sister's fear without even seeing her. Every time the sound came back, it was in a different spot, like someone circling slowly, brushing against the sides as they passed. I couldn't take it anymore. I think I whispered my sister's name, or maybe she whispered mine. I don't remember which of us broke first. But suddenly we were scrambling, fumbling with the zipper, pushing our way out of the tent and into the night. The moment the flap opened, the night felt enormous, and I remember the relief of standing up in open air. We must have been yelling, calling for our parents, because the caravan door opened almost instantly, and our dad stepped out in a rush, shirtless and blinking against the light. He looked around with that serious expression parents get when they think something's actually wrong, and he walked around the tent slowly, checking the grass, the trees, even shining a flashlight off into the dark field. He didn't find anything. No tracks, no movement, nothing. Just quiet and stillness, the kind that settles deep in your stomach. We got talked into trying again. Dad helped us settle back in, told us it was probably just the wind or a branch. We wanted to believe him. We didn't want to be babies, so we crawled back in, laid down, tried to be brave. It wasn't long before it started again. This time it was louder, less like brushing and more like rubbing. The whole side of the tent shifted slightly, the fabric pressing in like something had leaned against it. It moved again a minute later, just a little, just enough. The kind of movement you don't expect from a tent unless someone's touching it from the outside. I didn't wait this time. I grabbed the flashlight and hit the zipper in one motion, pushing the door open and almost falling out onto the grass. My sister was right behind me. We didn't even yell, we just ran to the caravan. Mom was already at the door by the time we got there, eyes wide, holding her robe closed. We were shaking. I couldn't find the words to explain, but I didn't need to. She pulled us inside without question. We didn't sleep in the tent again after that. For the rest of the trip, it sat there like a monument to our failed bravery. We'd glance at it during the day and laugh nervously, acting like it didn't scare us. But at night, we stayed in the caravan, curled up on the tiny couch bed, pretending not to flinch at every creak and sound from outside. A few days passed. I don't know if we were halfway through the trip or nearing the end, but the weather had started to shift. Cooler mornings, overcast skies. We'd stopped going on as many walks, and Dad was talking about heading home a little early if it rained. That morning, he stepped out with a coffee cup in one hand and said he was going to pack up the tent. I watched from the window as he unzipped the flap and started pulling the poles out, one by one. He was humming something under his breath. My sister and I stayed inside, not eager to get involved. He knelt down at one corner and paused. Then he bent lower, really close to the ground, and started brushing something away. I could see him frown. Then he reached into the tent and pulled the whole bottom edge aside, laying it flat on the grass. That's when I noticed the ground under the tent wasn't flat anymore. There were bumps, small ridges and mounds, uneven paths pressed into the soil beneath where our mattresses had been. Dad started poking at one with a stick. A little dirt gave way, and suddenly the ground shifted slightly, caving in like something hollow had been dug just underneath. Turns out animals had tunneled under the tent. Not big animals, nothing dangerous, but some kind of burrowing creature, maybe moles or voles or even rabbits. The tunnels were shallow, just a few inches under the surface, crisscrossing directly beneath where we'd slept. As they moved through at night, they must have rubbed against the tent floor, making it shift and press in slightly, especially where it sagged between the mattress edges. Since we were sleeping on inflatable mattresses, we didn't feel a thing beneath us. Just the sound. Just that soft, creepy scraping that made us imagine footsteps and circling strangers. Sounds so harmless now. Even as Dad explained it, showing us the narrow tunnels and crumbled dirt, I felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. There was no stranger out there. No one lurking in the woods or sneaking around our tent. Just some small animals going about their lives underground, unaware of the panic they'd caused above them. We laughed about it, eventually, but that night, the real first night, lying in the dark, hearing the rustling and brushing and not knowing what it was, those were real feelings, real fear. I'll never forget how big the world felt then, how thin that tent wall seemed, how quickly confidence disappears when you feel something you don't understand. It became a story we told for years, one of those camping memories that started with fear and ended in laughter. But even now, as an adult, I can still remember lying there with my heart in my throat, listening to something that wasn't supposed to be there. And I still don't like the idea of sleeping in a tent by myself, even when I know what's probably making the sound. Because in that moment when you don't know, that's the scariest thing in the world. About 20 years ago, I went on a camping and canoe trip that left a lasting impression on me, one I wouldn't forget for decades. It wasn't a typical weekend adventure with just friends. This trip included my dad, my two best friends from back then, and their dads. The plan was to paddle down a stretch of river known to be more challenging than usual, so we hired a guide to show us the way. Looking back, every part of the trip seemed normal at first, fun even. But there was something off about that guide, something we didn't catch until years later. We met the guide early in the morning, a lean man in his late 30s or early 40s, with weather-beaten skin and a quiet, reserved manner. He showed up with his own canoe and gear, blending into the group in a way that made him seem part of the team right away. The river we were about to navigate wasn't for beginners. It twisted and turned sharply through dense forests, its currents unpredictable. The plan was for the guide to lead us, make sure we avoided trouble, and maybe show us some hidden fishing spots along the way. The days were long but full of the kind of outdoor fun you only get when you're disconnected from the world. We spent most daylight hours paddling, sometimes fighting the current, sometimes drifting lazily. We caught fish whenever the river was calm enough to drop a line or cast a net. My friends and I would scramble to clean and prepare the fish for dinner, proud of what we caught. We used simple methods: fire-roasted fish wrapped in leaves or cooked over hot stones. The taste was smoky, fresh, and felt like a real reward after a day on the river. The guide, though, was a strange contrast to us. While we cooked fresh meals, he stuck to canned food, mostly fruit and those infamous beanie weenies. He never shared his food with us, and we rarely saw him touch what we made. I remember thinking how odd it was that he didn't seem interested in joining the communal meals or even talking much about his own preferences. There was something almost mechanical about how he ate his canned meals, and it made us uncomfortable, though we didn't understand why at the time. Our group tried to keep things light, swapping stories around the campfire, laughing about little things, but as the sun set each evening, a chill would creep in. One night in particular stood out. The air turned bitterly cold, sharper than any other night on the trip. We'd brought a small portable heater for emergencies, something my dad insisted on, saying it was better to be safe than sorry. When the cold hit, the guide asked if he could sleep in our tent with us, hoping to share the warmth. My dad politely declined, making up some excuse about space and the heater only being big enough for our immediate group. Still, he offered to share the heater's warmth outside the tent. The guide didn't protest and set up his sleeping area nearby, but I noticed the way he watched us carefully, his eyes dark and unreadable in the firelight. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I pushed the thoughts away. After all, he was just our guide. The next day, the river tested us harder. The currents grew faster, and the water was colder. We struggled against the push and pull of rapids, falling behind the guide's steady pace. He seemed completely at ease, navigating through obstacles like he knew every inch of the river by heart. Still, he never invited us to talk or asked about our lives. He was silent, almost invisible, like a shadow that never quite belonged. By the time the trip ended, I was relieved. The strange feeling had settled into a quiet suspicion I couldn't explain. We said goodbye to the guide, paid him, and went home with stories of the fish we caught and the rapids we conquered. I didn't think about him again until years later. 5 years after that trip, I was sitting in my living room, casually watching the local news with my dad and one of my friends. The anchor's face appeared on the screen, and suddenly the story caught my attention. It was about a man wanted for terrible crimes, including the abuse of children. The police had finally caught him after years on the run. The face they showed was hauntingly familiar. It was the guide from our canoe trip. I remember feeling a knot tighten in my stomach as I recognized him immediately. The quiet, cold man who ate canned fruit and beanie weenies without sharing, the one who asked to sleep in our tent, was not just a guide. He was a criminal the police had been chasing for a long time, a man with a dark and twisted history we never imagined. The news showed photos of children who had survived him, and the relief in their faces mixed with pain was heartbreaking. After that, the memory of our trip took on a new shape. Every moment, every strange glance from the guide, felt like a warning I hadn't listened to. The nights I felt uneasy, the coldness I couldn't explain. It all made sense in a way I wished it never would. My dad and I talked about it quietly, how we had unknowingly shared warmth with a dangerous man and how lucky we were to be safe. Years have passed since then, but I still think about that trip whenever I go camping or hear the sound of a river rushing by. It taught me that people can hide terrible things beneath calm faces. And sometimes, you don't know who's really there until it's too late. The wilderness was always wild, but it wasn't the nature that scared me. It was the darkness some people carry inside them. That story stays with me, a reminder that safety isn't just about gear or preparation, but about paying attention to the small signs. The ones that whisper warnings you might not want to hear but must never ignore. Back when I was in high school, I had this routine on Friday and Saturday nights that became almost sacred. A buddy of mine and I would hang out with a couple of girls from a nearby town. Nothing too wild, just simple, innocent teenage stuff. One of the girls' families owned this small cabin out in the country, set near a creek that ran through thick woods. It was the kind of place that felt miles away from everything, like a pocket of quiet the rest of the world forgot about. We'd usually meet up there, sit around, talk, laugh, and just enjoy the peace. The cabin itself was old but solid, weathered wood with a small porch that overlooked the creek. The windows were a little grimy, and the door creaked if you didn't shut it right. Inside, the furniture was sparse. An old couch, a couple of chairs, a small table with some magazines on it, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. But the best part was outside, right where the trees started thickening and the creek curved around. That's where we'd hang out most nights, sitting on logs or rocks, just watching the water move and talking about whatever was going on in our lives. One night, everything felt normal at first. We got there around dusk and settled into the usual spots. The girls were telling stories about their week at school while my buddy and I listened, half paying attention and half just enjoying the quiet sound of the creek flowing by. The air was cool but not cold, the kind of crisp night that makes you feel alert but relaxed at the same time. As the night got darker, the woods around us seemed to come alive. You could hear the usual sounds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, the faint call of an owl somewhere far off. But then, out of nowhere, we started hearing noises that didn't quite fit with the peaceful background. At first, it was just faint, something crashing through the bushes deeper in the forest. Not a soft rustle, but the sound of branches snapping, leaves crunching. It was like whatever it was moving fast, heavy-footed, breaking through underbrush. We glanced at each other but didn't say much. We figured it was probably just deer or some other wildlife. There were plenty of deer around those parts, and they could be pretty noisy if they got spooked. We settled back down and tried to ignore it, hoping it would pass. The girls joked about it being a bear or some wild animal, but they laughed it off too. Still, we all noticed the way the noises seemed to get closer, louder, and then quieter again, like something was circling us just out of sight. Then, something happened that changed the whole mood. While we were sitting on the porch, just talking quietly, I heard a scraping noise. At first, it was soft and irregular, like someone dragging a stick across the wood siding of the cabin. Then it got louder, more deliberate, like someone was trying to get our attention or maybe just messing around, scratching the side of the building. At the same time, a thick fog started rolling in. It came out of nowhere, creeping over the ground, swirling around the trees and covering the creek. It wasn't the kind of fog you expect in the morning. It was heavy, wet, and cold, settling in fast and making everything look blurry and strange. The cabin lights cut through it like weak beacons, but beyond that, visibility dropped to just a few feet. The combination of the scraping noise and the fog made my skin crawl. My heart started to race, but I tried not to let it show. The girls were quieter now, glancing nervously into the trees, gripping their jackets tighter. The forest that had felt like a safe, calm place just minutes ago now seemed threatening and unfamiliar. We didn't say anything for a long time, just listening and watching. The scraping stopped after maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but the fog didn't lift. The woods were dead silent except for the soft hum of the creek and the distant hoot of an owl. My buddy and I kept scanning the tree line, trying to catch any movement, but there was nothing visible. After about 30 minutes of sitting frozen, the fog thick and the night fully dark, we all agreed it was time to leave. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all scared. The calm, innocent hangout had turned into something tense and creepy. We packed up quickly, stuffing the girls into the car first and then heading out. As we drove down the gravel road away from the cabin, headlights cutting through the fog, something caught my eye. About 50 yards ahead, standing on the side of the road, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or maybe a tree stump, but as we got closer, I could see a man. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that blended into the night. His arms hung loose by his sides, and his head was tilted forward slightly, but his eyes were wide open and staring straight ahead. That's when I realized it was more than a stare. It was a 1,000-yard stare, like he was somewhere else entirely, like he wasn't really there with us at all. He walked slowly, almost mechanically, down the middle of the road. There was no hurry, no reason, just a steady, eerie shuffle. The fog swirled around him like a veil, making him look even more like something out of a nightmare. It was like he was a character from one of those horror movies you watch just to get creeped out, the kind of guy you don't want to meet alone in the dark. We didn't slow down or stop. The girls were quiet, gripping the car doors. My buddy and I kept our eyes on the figure in the headlights until he disappeared into the fog behind us. The whole way back, none of us spoke. We just wanted to get away as fast as possible. Once we were back in town, lights and people and noise, the fog and the noises and that figure all felt distant, like a bad dream. But I never forgot the way that night felt. How the woods had shifted from a place of peace to a place of fear. How something or someone had been out there, watching or maybe just lost. It never came back, and nothing else happened at that cabin. No attacks, no more noises, no explanations. Just that one night, that one foggy, scraping, silent moment where we all realized the world outside the safety of the small cabin wasn't as friendly as we thought. Looking back, I think what scared me most wasn't the noises or the fog, or even that man walking down the road. It was how quickly everything changed from normal to something unsettling. How close we were to something unknown and unknowable just beyond the trees. That night taught me that sometimes, danger doesn't need to show itself clearly to make you feel its presence. Even now, years later, if I'm out somewhere quiet near the woods and hear a strange noise or catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows, I remember that night. And I remember that slow walk down the road, the empty eyes, and the fog swallowing everything around us. It's the kind of memory that sticks with you, not because anything happened to you, but because you know how close it came.